From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Guha. This definitely is a very special day today, and I want to welcome everyone here to the Library of Congress. I see a lot of old familiar faces, friends, and many new faces. As Guha said, today is a very special day for many, many reasons, and you'll be hearing them from a range of all of us throughout the day, but not the least of which, this is one of the first opportunities for us to really mark and acknowledge a very gratifying and productive partnership between the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The museum is represented here today by several staff members, and please forgive me if I do not mention you all, but I did want to sort of shout out and call out our three of the core members of this collaborative team over the last 5 years: Kinshasa Conwell-Holman, Rex Ellis, and Elaine Nichols. And I think you'll probably hear those names again, but yes, let's give them a hand. This partnership came into being about 5 years ago as a congressionally mandated initiative to focus on the civil rights movement to obtain justice, freedom, and equality for African Americans in the time period between 1954 and 1968. The 2009 public law, known as the Civil Rights History Project Act, directed the two institutions to, first of all, conduct a national survey of existing oral history collections about the movement in those 2 decades, and secondly, to record new interviews with participants in the struggle. The museum took on the task of producing the interviews, and the library assumed the responsibility for conducting the survey and also for managing, processing, and cataloging the video recordings of the interviews. And that has been the basic division of labor for the last 5 years. Shortly, you will get a detailed demonstration from the CRHP, and forgive the acronyms, but it makes it easier, the CRHP staff on the exciting results of this collaboration, including a couple of technical innovations that have long-term promise, I think, for archival collections in general. And when we launch the CRHP website in the library's new Project One environment. So I will just mention a few of the highlights of these last 5 years and all this incredible work that has gone on. And the highlights being that the survey database contains records and information on over 1,500 collections that are housed in over 600 repositories across the country. It continues to be updated and added as new information becomes available to us, so please check that out. The website features over 50 full-length video interviews at the moment. These represent a little over half of the total number recorded by the interview team from the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, under the direction of the museum. And the remaining interviews will be released on the site soon and will also be made available through the library's iTunes and YouTube platforms. So please, I encourage you to look at it all. We are fortunate to have a few of the interviewees here today with us. I know Dory Ladner and Joyce Ladner, whom you will be hearing from later in this afternoon, are here, and others that I know Rex Ellis will be talking about. But I encourage everyone to seek out and listen to these compelling, rich stories, unedited, uncut, on the website, on YouTube, on iTunes. I also want to thank on behalf of the library and the American Folklife Center and the museum, I would also like to thank the CRHP Advisory Committee. They set the direction for the project over this course of time in terms of who to interview, what to focus on, and the scope of the initiative when we all met at the outset of the project in 2010. They've continued to support us all along, and we thank them for their wisdom and support and dedication. I also want to thank the congressional sponsors of the bill, and I know they will be thanked throughout the program, but without them, this project would not have happened. And I particularly want to thank Representative Carolyn McCarthy of New York, and another key supporter and champion of both the library and the museum, Congressman John Lewis of Georgia. The events today are part of a longer or larger series of public programs being developed by the American Folklife Center over the course of this last year. And the series is called Many Paths to Freedom, Looking Back, Looking Ahead at the Long Civil Rights Movement. And I should say, today's event is sort of happening in three parts. After we have a viewing of the website and how the website is going to work, we will be moving into two other components of this program, and I want to urge all of you to stay for that. As part of the series, we'll do the website, and then this afternoon we will be featuring a roundtable discussion and focusing on Mississippi Freedom Summer, 1964, one of the more volatile and important summers and periods of time in the civil rights movement. The program will involve both a retrospective analysis, a look back at the history-changing of events of 50 years ago, and a discussion of the continuing importance of the freedom struggle in shaping present and future actions. The participants in the discussion are four individuals who were key participants in the events of that summer: Joyce and Dory Ladner, who I mentioned previously, Charlie Cobb, and Bob Moses. The session will be moderated by Wesley Hogan, director of the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. And after we conclude this roundtable discussion, Bob Moses will also deliver the culminating address today. So we have a full and rich day for you. Oh dear. And lastly, before I bring up our next speakers, I just want to say, while this is a public unveiling of the website today, the museum and the Folklife Center have been working with these interviews and mining this material over the last few years. We have been presenting at scholarly meetings and conferences. We have been doing public programs. We have been including material and excerpts in blogs, and we'll continue doing that throughout the next several years. For a long time. We will also be including our work in many programs that the library has been putting on over the last year and will continue to put on throughout the course of the summer, including the the exhibit which commemorates the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which will be opening very soon, and which our next speaker will be telling us a little bit more about. But again, welcome, and I want to turn the microphone over to one of the great supporters of this project in the library, the Associate Librarian, Roberta Shaffer. Roberta?
Thank you, Betsy, and everyone for being here today. This is really an exciting day. I think that word cannot be overused, and there's a lot to celebrate, and of course, there is a lot of work that remains to be done and accomplished in the months and years ahead. Betsy mentioned that we will be opening our major exhibition on June 19th that will commemorate the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I hope all of you will come. We're giving you absolutely no excuses because it will be one of our longest running shows. It will be up in our Jefferson building for not 1 year, but 366 days. And we hope that you will come and see it. In January, we will replace many of the items, so we want to make sure you come not once, but twice. And we really believe that not only does it tell the story of the civil rights movement and the actual passage of the act, with a little bit of a glimpse of the impact of the act, but I think it will inspire audiences to think about the rest of the struggle and what really remains to be done. In addition to the exhibition, we have had now since August, and we have just extended, a really phenomenal show called A Day Like No Other, which is photographs from the actual March on Washington. And that is also in the Jefferson Building, and frankly, just by popular demand, we keep extending it. People come in and they are so touched by the photography. And I think once these 55 interviews that are part of this project are launched today, and then the others begin to roll out, we will have the same kind of acclaim, because there is something so powerful about hearing something in somebody's own words, or seeing people spontaneously who participated in a march. And that's why it's really so critical that projects like this are supported. This is a terrific collaboration. 3 major cultural institutions, the University of North Carolina, Smithsonian, and the Library of Congress. But what we are really hoping is that we will be adding to this many, many more collaborators who will find ways to use this project in the classroom or simply to ask themselves questions. Last week I had the pleasure, really, of just listening to snippets from Chuck McAdoo and Ruby Sales' interview. And I have not stopped thinking about those interviews all weekend. In the case of Chuck's interview, the whole idea of embracing the principle of nonviolence and how he talks about that in the interview, questioning whether that really is the appropriate way to implement social change. We think of that as so much a part of the movement that we don't go back to that time and ask ourselves, was that the most effective way to get our voices heard? And then Ruby Sales, who talked about how she was going on with a life and committed to studying Emily Dickinson and the fine poets of the past, and all of a sudden participated in an event that literally changed her life. And so I am hoping that school children and all citizens everywhere across the world will be able to listen to these interviews and ask themselves questions that are contemporary, that affect our lives and how we want to live and the legacy we want to pass on. So I thank all of you for being here, for being collaborators up to now, but I tell you, we are going to keep tapping on your shoulder. And so please do not rest. And thank you again for everything you've done to date. Betsy?
Thanks, Roberta. And before I introduce our next speaker, I must correct an omission. With so many people working on this project, it is there is always the danger and possibility of not thanking an organization or individuals that should be thanked. And I certainly want to acknowledge the co-sponsorship and help of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Legacy Project in developing and making the whole events of today happen. And I know Charlene Krantz is here and Cortland Cox, and I really want to thank you for your participation. And so with that said, I will introduce the next speaker, Rex Ellis, Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Rex.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I knew you were out there. You know, I bring you greetings from Lonnie Bunch, the director, the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You know, there's a story of a young man who arrived early in his classroom one morning before all of his other classmates arrived. And because he had a little time on his hands, he thought he would sit at his desk and he thought he would drum a little bit, so he did. And as he began drumming and drumming and drumming and drumming, it got good to him. And as it got good to him and better to him and better to him, he completely, everything around him just sort of left him. And all he was doing was drumming. Kids came in, and one kid looked at him and said, oh, he's so stupid. And then he's drumming. Another one comes in and says, oh, the natives are restless today. And he keeps on drumming, and another one comes in and says something negative, and then all of a sudden somebody says something that he hears, and it affects him for the entire day. He thinks about what he has done as being something wrong, and he decides that it is just something that he could not have been forgiven for, and he shouldn't have done what he did. All day long, he was just in a horrible, horrible mood. At the end of the day, he had a choice between walking home or he could ride the bus. He decided he would walk home because it was just a small way away. And when he walked home, there was a park. And sometimes he'd go out and he'd look at the trees swaying back and forth, and he'd look at the ducks, and it'd make him feel better. So he decided he'd go out to the park, and he'd look at the ducks, and he went out, and he was still feeling bad about what had happened earlier that day. But when he looked around and he saw all the things in the park, he looked down and he saw a man. He saw a man, and a man had a bunch of balloons in his hands, and he saw kids come over, and each kid would take a balloon, and they'd go off, and the balloons were red and green and yellow and blue and all different colors. He'd see the balloons, and after a while the kids would begin to play, and they'd forget they had the balloons in their hands. And so he saw yellow balloons floating up in the air, red balloons floating up in the air, green balloons floating up in the air. And he looked down at the man, and the man had sold all of his balloons except one balloon, and that was a brown balloon. He went over to the man, and he looked at the balloon, and he looked at the man, and looked at the balloon, and said, will that balloon fly too? The man gave him the balloon, and he pushed it away from him. He said, now let the balloon go. He let the balloon go, and the balloon began to float up in the air. And as the balloon floated in the air further and further, it lifted the little boy's spirits, and he looked at the balloon, he looked at it, and he waved at the balloon as it was going away, and the balloon vendor looks at him and he says, you see, it's not what's on the outside, it's what's on the inside that makes the balloon fly. That story is important because it reminds me of these oral histories. Collecting these oral histories have allowed us the blessing of learning and hearing and looking on the inside of over 130 individuals over the last 5 years. This experience has transformed all of us neophytes students and observers of a movement that we knew changed the nation to an informed understanding of a period of our history that was much more than that. It changed the world. We have listened to, we have cried with, we have welcomed recollections of, and we have awakened memories. We have sat at the feet of witnesses and have collected the stories of countless individuals, many of whom were not well known, but all of them who made important contributions to the freedom moment, the freedom movement. Some of these individuals provided housing, some of them provided food, some of them provided money, some of them even provided protection for the lives of those searching for justice and equality. Those organizing and strategizing with nothing but the faith and the belief that nonviolent direct action would turn the swords of hate and intolerance and bigotry into plowshares. They organized voter registration drives, freedom rides, bus boycotts, sit-ins. They sat in jails, slept in barns, left colleges and universities that their parents were convinced would provide them with a leg up and a way out, but they chose instead to leave and to engage in an education that focused on their collective future and to guarantee that the future and the soul of our nation was assured. We have learned so much about what motivated many of them. One major incident was the death of 14-year-old Emmett Till on August of 1955. His brutal death was a pivotal moment that touched the hearts of so many of these soldiers of freedom. Many of the persons that we interviewed were motivated to become involved in the movement because they were close to Till's age, and they could identify with the injustices of racial hatred that put one's safety, especially in the South, in constant jeopardy. They felt an overwhelming sense that they were centered in a pivotal time that was ripe for change for all of them, black and white and young and not so young. Their decision to get involved and to contribute to changing America was a personal decision. With this process, we have developed a greater appreciation of all of those people who played an important role in the movement, grassroots organizers, supporters, and leaders all. You know, during the 1950s and 60s, these people literally risked their lives to change our world. By their actions, they reminded us of the courage we had if we but tapped into it. They taught us about struggle, lest we forget that nothing worthwhile comes without great struggle. They taught us about love, even in the face of overwhelming hate. They taught us about love. We could not have accomplished this monumental task that we entered into with the Library of Congress without the Library of Congress and the American Folklife Center staff and their support and their dedication in this project. And we also would like to acknowledge and thank our Smithsonian leadership. I need to do that if I want to keep a job. And that is our Secretary, Wayne Clough, our founding director, I've already mentioned, Lonnie Bunch. We have our deputy director here, Kinshasa Holman Conwell, Lynn Chase, for their leadership and their dedication to this project. And I need to mention some of the other folk too. We had a scholarly advisory committee, and it was composed of Thomas Battle, Maya Bay, Julian Bond, Millicent Brown, Taylor Branch, Tracy McMyer, Bernice Johnson Reagan, Clement Price, Patricia Sullivan, who is here today, Patricia Turner. We had a supportive staff from the Smithsonian, Elaine Nichols, who was here, who I think must have been on every interview, Marion Gill, Carlos Bustamante, Dory Butter, Dwendolyn Reese, LaFleur Peso, who's here as well, Drew Talley, Laura Coyle, Kathleen McSweeney, Isabel Meyer, Crystal Sanchez. There were contractors from the University of North Carolina, David Klein, Emily Crosby, John Dittmer, Will Griffin, Seth Koth, Hassan Kwame Jeffries, Joseph Mosnier, Kieran Taylor, and John Bishop. Diane Swan Wright was also a part, and so was Greg Palumbo. In establishing the Civil Rights History Project legislation, Congress noted that there was a critical need to capture these stories now, as many of the former CRM participants were passing away and they were losing valuable information. We were losing valuable information with their death. During the course of this project, we have lost several persons that we interviewed, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge them. Alfred Scott Bates, Judge Robert Carter, Lawrence Giat, Clara Luper, Stephen McNichols, Alfred Moldovan, Judge Matthew Perry, Pete Seeger. Finally, our museum will be using many of the interviews in a variety of ways. This will include placing them in a number of the museum's exhibitions. In 2005, or the latter part of 2005, when we rise like an albatross on the corner of 14th and Constitution, we will have those memories and these pieces that we've put together as a part of that museum as well, in interactives that we do, in the media that we do, in public and educational programs. You know, this was a wonderful experience, one that has been enhanced in so many ways by our partnership with Library of Congress. It's been a journey that we hope ensures a long relationship, Betsy, and we are grateful to have been part of it. My last duty I know that Chuck Hicks, and I know that Dory, and I know that Bob Moses and Charlene. I know that all of you are here. Everybody who was involved in the movement in some way, shape, or form, or who were involved in the interview, all of you civil rights soldiers, would you please stand so we can acknowledge you? I know that out in the audience also is a representative from Representative Carolyn McCarthy's office. His name is Marcus Garza. Marcus, are you still here? Would you please come and give us a few words from Representative McCarthy? And I'm done.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Marcus Garza. I'm a legislative assistant for Congresswoman Carolyn McCarthy. Unfortunately, the Congresswoman couldn't be here today, but she asked me to come down and say a few words to all of you and thank the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian for the hard work that you guys have been doing. And especially I want to thank Kate and Guha and Betsy and Brenda for having me over last week to kind of give me a brief overview of the project. Relatively new staffer in the office, so I wasn't aware of the fruits of the Congresswoman's past endeavors. So it was interesting to come in and kind of scratch the surface and learn more about the project, which many of you know, my boss sponsored the legislation which established the project back in 2009. Just want to make a quick note that it passed unanimously by Congress. It's not something that happens rarely these days with bipartisan support, and the President signed it quickly after establishing the project in 2009. So just wanted to come by and say thank you. Hope you spread the word about this project. Our office has been trying to put it on our website and put it out on social media so that people have access to this great resource that the Smithsonian and Library of Congress have established and have been working on for the past 5 years. So it's a great project. Thank you all for allowing us to be a part of it and be here today to speak on it. And thank you for the great work that you've done and especially the great work that you're continuing to do. So thank you all.
And by the way, the links to these websites are on the blue handout. If you didn't get one, it's at the table on the way out. So this survey database we had 4 researchers help us kind of scour the country, looking for oral history collections in archives, museums, libraries, historical societies across the country. Wanted to get a sense of what is out there. So they spent about 6 months doing this, resulted in way more collections than we really thought were possible. So it's we have 1,532 collections, and many of these collections include multiple interviews, some of them up to 100, 200 interviews. So we didn't count all of those, but we know that there are many thousands of them. You can browse the repositories if you want to get a sense of what is in your state or what is close to you. We listed them all that way. For instance, you can see what's in Arizona. These are the repositories there that have collections on the civil rights movement. And we wanted to include their contact information so you can get in touch with them directly. So each collection has a record. And we just wanted to include information about the collection. We don't include any of their content on our website. We'll often include links if they have something up on their website about it so you can get to it directly. We subject catalog all of these, and we have many ways of searching. You can search by interviewee name from the main site. Down here on this quick search. Keywords. You can also browse by subject. We have over 1,800 subject headings in this, which is probably more than you'd ever need to know. But we've organized them by topics such as education, employment, politics, so you can get to them more easily that way. And we hope that we've had a lot of great feedback about this. We know that many researchers studying the civil rights movement have used it. We think it's a great resource for teachers also to find collections specifically about the movement from where they are. This is our new site with all the interviews. This is a new format that the library has used. We're moving all of our digital collections to a more user-friendly site that we're calling Project One. right now we have 55 interviews up, and so we have videos up. You can get to it from collection items. They're all in a list here. So here's, each one of them has a video to click on, and you can watch the whole thing there. They range, some of them are half an hour up to 2 hours. One is almost 4 hours. But they all have transcripts, PDFs that you can click on. This link will get you there. From the main site, you can also search all the transcripts together at once, which is a nice feature that we haven't been able to do before. Anything else you want to show? No? Okay. Thank you. And Guha's going to show some clips now.
As has been mentioned, we have had some 55 or so interviews which we've launched on the site. And among the pleasures of watching and listening and being here at the among the pleasures of being at the library is to actually get to do things like do research, which is what I call it when I'm sitting there editing videos. And to that end, I wanted to show you a couple of clips from some of the interviews that have now been up to date. These interviews are notable for a lot of things, one of which is that even over the course of 50 years, the memories of participants in the struggle are sharp and vivid. My colleague Joe Monnier, who was one of the interviewers, has remarked that in all the interviews that he did, there was not one triumphalist narrative. That is, there wasn't a sense that, oh yeah, we did it, it's over, it's done with, civil rights, we won. It's all about continuing the struggle to maintaining the legacy and the energy of that movement in the moment in the present day for many of the people who are involved. And this afternoon's program is going to give you further indication of the ways in which participants, veterans of the struggle have continued to keep the fire burning. One of the things that we also wanted to do when we were doing these interviews was to look at not just the period of legislation which was in the mandate, which is between 1954 and 1968, but invariably and very purposefully, interviewees were asked about their longer experiences, that is to stretch out the notion of civil rights to the longer and connect it to the longer black freedom struggle. So you have people talking back, for instance, in this interview with Bill Saunders from South Carolina, you will notice that he's going to mention a very pivotal moment for men of a certain generation, his experiences in Korea and the way in which those experiences overseas, as they had for previous generations in World War II and World War I, the way in which those played a part in their activism and their coming to terms with the kinds of injustices that were present in America. So let me see if I can get this thing to play, which is often a fraught issue.
You confronted more racism in Hawaii than you had encountered on Johns Island or in Charleston even.
Hawaii and the military, even in Korea.
Yeah.
Racism was real bad in Korea, but and in Hawaii, and I just realized later on it was right after 1951. They had just really integrated the army. Mm-hmm. There were 4 blacks in our company, with 1 Hispanic, 1 Indian, and we were the really. And I didn't realize until many years later that all of these people, poor white men, who also had a lot of problems, mm-hmm. and the only place that they could vent any of those problems was on people like me. So they had their own problem reason, and we had a lot of fights with that.
What kinds of, I mean, do you remember particular instances of?
Oh, I've had physical fights, and a guy would beat me, but my grandmother told me I had such a bad temper. I get real mad. I don't give up, so I don't stop when people say to stop. So I end up being the one getting in trouble. But they did so many things to the blacks. We had one guy, one of my best friends who died recently, made him dig a 6x6x6 hole, and the sergeant drop a dime in it, and then make him close it up. Those are the kinds of stuff that we went through. And it's a lot of it coming back to me more and more now. It's having a lot of flashback with that. Even in Korea in the war, I mean, the guy, my first sergeant, who I didn't know, on the front line, we just fought for 2 days, and I was going up the hill on top, and he said, "You black son of a bitch, if you come up here, I'll blow your brains out." And he had a 45 on me. And I decided at that point I was carrying my rifle was in the hole, and I was going to roll and get my gun, like you saw some of them movies. And then I said, that 45 blow a hole straight through you, because I've seen 45 shot people with the hole back out. I went back to my hole and stayed there. When it was time for us to leave, he sent for me and said that had made me lead the whole company out, and of course, being in front, you get killed first, so he wanted to make sure that was in front going out, and those kinds of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that we can laugh about, because if you don't, you cry about it. But the racism was just really heavy. And coming back, even into California, when we got back as heroes, because I got wounded and we were there in California, they start calling out the white soldiers' name, and then they called the black soldiers. I never understood that until we got on. But black and white soldiers couldn't ride in the same train coach across America, so you had to ride in separate coaches.
So Bill Saunders, in this interview, remembers his childhood on Johns Island, South Carolina, working with Esau Jenkins, local famed civil rights leader. As you recall, as you see, he's talked about his experiences in the war, and also discusses funding the Low Country newsletter, helping the workers in the Charleston hospital strike of 1969. So we try and cover, in the true sense of the word, an oral history, trying to give you a complete picture of who these individuals were. Let me move on to another particular interview. And this one is from Chuck McDew. Chuck McDew, as was known to many of you, was born in 1938 in Massillon, Ohio. He attended Roosevelt University and South Carolina State University, worked as a community organizer and educator at Metropolitan State University of Minnesota. In the interview, Mr. McDew recalls growing up in Massillon. His family is involved in the steel mill unions and now attending South Carolina State University, making that long trek from north to south. He remembers being arrested 3 times in 2 days for not obeying segregation laws, and in this excerpt, he will talk about his involvement in participation in SNCC, the organization, in the founding of SNCC.
And we were there discussing the movement, and with students from all over the South. During that meeting, Dr. King felt we should all join SCLC. I disagreed, because Dr. King felt if you use the practice nonviolence, that you should accept nonviolence as a way of life in your life. I disagreed with that, because I said, yes, I use nonviolence and we use nonviolence, but for me it was strictly a tactic. And I didn't believe, and personally I didn't believe it would work. It was a tactic that I think had a short life and wouldn't work. My position was when When Gandhi tried nonviolence in South Africa, he was beaten, jailed, and run out of the country. As it said in the United States, nonviolence won't work, because when Gandhi used in India the tactic of having people lay down on railroad tracks to protest, I said, and it worked. I said, but if a group of black people lay down on railroad tracks here in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, any of these southern states, a train would run you over and back up to make certain you are dead. You cannot make a moral appeal in the midst of an amoral society. And I said, felt it was not immoral. We lived in a society that was amoral. And as such, nonviolence was not going to work. And so said I couldn't, and the people with me could not join Dr. King. And thank you, but no thanks. And then said those, people said who agree, who think like I do, we'll have a meeting down the hall and talk about it. And that meeting we had down the hall became the first meeting, was the genesis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was at that meeting at Shaw and Raleigh, Shaw campus in April 1960 that we went down the hall and talked about forming a new group. And at first we were going to call that group the Student Coordinating Committee, and we were just going to exchange ideas between campuses. But there were some people in the group who still greatly believed in nonviolence and the viability of nonviolence and practices of nonviolence. And we felt they should be a part of the group. And most of those students were from Nashville and had been taught by Jim Lawson. And I knew Jim Lawson, and he was an important person to me. And so we thought it was a good thing to include nonviolence in our title. And so we created this new group and called it the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
How many of you knew that story before? A couple, obviously the historians in the audience. This will come as a revelation, I think, to all of us who are new to the topic. It overwhelms me every time I see it, and I think you'll have that same experience when you all consult the site. Now, we have an afternoon program coming, but I'm going to do a little tap dancing simply because one of our key participants in the next session, Charlie Cobb, is, even as we speak, being bundled onto a cab at the Kojo Namdi show's portal and is being sped down here for the next program. We will have a film in between, but I'm going to take the luxury of having being up here and show you one last clip from these interviews, and then we'll maybe entertain a few questions as well. Let me see this one. This one is from the interview that we did with Ruby Sales, whom Ellis Shaffer mentioned a little earlier. Ruby Sales, this wide-ranging interview in 2011 discusses her father's military career, growing up in Columbus, Georgia, attending Tuskegee University. She recalls joining SNCC, the Selma to Montgomery March, registering voters in Lowndes County, Alabama, and her arrest in Hayneville, Alabama, which was a pivotal moment in her life, which led to the murder of the young seminary student Jonathan Daniels, and then discusses her opinions of African-American history and African-American incarceration today. In this excerpt, I wanted to focus on particularly because she reflects and focuses on the crucial difference between the popular understanding of what many of us who are not in the struggle have about the civil rights movement, so-called, and what I think folks on the ground and on the front lines call the freedom struggle. So let me see if I can get this to play.
I prefer to call it, in retrospect, the Southern Freedom Movement, because it was not only a movement for civil rights, but it was also a movement for human dignity. It was also a movement to abolish the violence and terrorism that whites executed against black people for more than 100 years during segregation. It was also a movement that where we wanted to move from the small spaces that segregation pressed us down into larger spaces that gave us expression, creative, political, and social expression. And the reason why I say it was a Southern Freedom Movement, on the other hand, is that the results of this movement not only humanized black people, but it had the possibility of opening up the world for white people so that they could lead a more meaningful life. And the other part about being a movement is that this was not an event. This was a dynamic process that was connected to many events that had happened in the black community, like the student movement, the Southern Negro Youth Cooperative in the 1940s. So we just didn't spring up out of nowhere. And so that the other part about the Southern Freedom Movement is that there was a direct connection between the aims of Southern black education and the ultimate explosion of the Southern Freedom Movement. And I think that when you limit it to civil rights, you obscure, first of all, the horrors of segregation. You do not have to come to terms with the violence. You do not have to come to terms with the economic oppression. You do not have to come to terms with white people who wanted to turn black schools into plantations. You do not have to come to terms with the fact that no black girl was safe from rape in that society. No black girl was safe from rape in that society. You obscure all of that. And at the same time, you obscure the long, hard years of black struggle and the blood and the sacrifice that we had poured into that struggle. I think that it does not do justice by limiting it to, and it's really not accurate to limit it to the movement. And one other point I want to make about that is that when we look at Rosa Parks, people often think that she did that because of her civil rights and wanting to sit down on the bus. But she also did that. It was a rebellion of maids, a rebellion of working class women who were tired of boarding the bus in Montgomery, the public space, and being assaulted and called out of their names and abused by white bus drivers. And that's why that movement could hold so long. If it had just been merely a protest about riding the bus, it might have shattered. But it went to the very heart of black womanhood, and black women played a major role in sustaining that movement. And so that's why I think it's really important to see the larger context. I don't think a civil rights movement could have lasted as long as this movement did, without the cultural nuances of God, without the theology, without the intimacy, without the connections, and without the strong desire to be first-class human beings.
Thank you very much. We're going to take about a 7-minute break, so we can, I know 7, yes, I said 7, I meant 7. Because sorry about that. We're going to take a brief break to reset the stage, and we're going to get ready for the second part of our 3-part program, which is a film called The Streets of Greenwood, filmed in 1963. You will see some of the principals who are going to be here later on, and it sort of sets the context in which SNCC and other frontline activists and local people struggled and fought against white supremacy and white racial terror. And you'll see some of the, I think, a really compelling set of materials And we'll hopefully use that as a way to frame this afternoon's discussion, which is going to be coming up in just a few minutes. Like I said, I'm still holding out hope that Charlie Cobb will get here just in time to join us. But please take a break. The cafeteria is right next door. If you can get a cup of coffee if you like. They may be closing very shortly, so go ahead. Feel free to use the facilities and all of that. Thank you. Let's started here in just a second. So once we do that, if Jay and John, if you can help out by taking the lights down, we'll start the movie. That'd be lovely. Okay, folks, please take your seats if you would very kindly do so. We are getting to a little long in the program. So I'm going to start it and hope everybody falls in line. Herding cats. Great. Okay, we're going to take a couple of minutes here just to get ready for the next round of round table. Well, imagine a table, if you will, and imagine that it's round, and then you'll get the sense of what's going on. I was just reminded by my friend Steve Winnick that the streets of Greenwood 1964 and the attitudes espoused there were startlingly and unfortunately similar to what's happening out in Nevada and the standoff in the desert by Clive and Bundy. I was also reminded as I heard about love what Frantz Fanon once said way back when, beware the white man who loves the Negro. Those are all really provocative. It's a provocative movie. It's a really interesting movie, and it comes to us courtesy from our colleagues at the Motion Picture Broadcast Recorded Sound Division at the library, which has treasures upon treasures of movies like that, many historical documentaries, and Alan Gevinson, I'd like to thank especially for this particular one. Thank you, Alan. Okay, so we're going to move on to the discussion, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, Adrian Cannon from the Manuscripts Division. Adrian is the curator of the division. If you would come on up, Adrian. And she's going to set the stage for our guests. And if our guests would like to file up on stage, Wesley and folks, come on up, make yourself at home. Watch the water, if you would.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Library of Congress, I would like to welcome you to this roundtable discussion on the events of Mississippi Freedom Summer to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the project. The discussion is part of a series of public programs developed by the American Folklife Center in collaboration with other divisions of the library, as well as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee project and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel, beginning with our speakers. Robert Bob Paris Moses is founder and president of the Algebra Project Incorporated. He received his BA from Hamilton College and his MA in philosophy from Harvard University. He was a prominent figure in the civil rights movement as field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, most commonly known as SNCC. In 1961, he initiated SNCC's Mississippi Voter Registration Project and was appointed its director in 1962. He helped lead the Council of Federated Organizations into the Mississippi Summer Project, 1964 Freedom Summer, which parachuted the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. In 1982, he received a MacArthur Fellowship and started the Algebra Project, which uses mathematics as an organizing tool for a quality education as a constitutional right for all students. He is the co-author with Charles E. Cobb, Jr. of Radical Equations from Mississippi to Algebra Project, and co-editor of Quality Education as a Constitutional Right, creating a grassroots movement to transform public schools. In 2011 to 2012, he was Distinguished Visitor for the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University and a visiting lecturer at New York University School of Law in 2012 and 2013. Dory Ladner is an activist and licensed graduate social worker. She attended Tougaloo College, where she and her sister Joyce organized civil rights protests along with Medgar Evers, Vernon Damer, Clyde Kennard, and other SNCC students. She went on to earn a master's degree from Howard University School of Social Work and became an accredited licensed independent clinical social worker. One of the founding members of the Council of Federated Organizations, Dory Ladner was the first woman to join COFO's staff at Jackson office. She organized voter registration campaigns during Mississippi Freedom Summer and served as SNCC's project director in Natchez in 1965. She also participated in and helped organize several major civil rights actions, including the 1964 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March, and the 1968 Poor People's March. As an anti-poverty community organizer in St. Louis, she was an early advocate of civil rights in housing and employment. Ms. Ladner is the recipient of the 2011 Humanitarian Award from the Fannie Lou Hamer National Institute on Citizenship and Democracy. Joyce Ladner is an activist and sociologist. She received her BA from Tougaloo College and went to the University of Washington to earn her PhD. She served as SNCC Field Secretary, organizing with local communities in Jackson, Greenwood, and Canton, Mississippi, as well as Albany, Georgia. In 1963, she worked for Bayard Rustin, helping to organize the March on Washington. Dr. Ladner was the first woman president of Howard University from 1994 to 1995, where she also served as professor of sociology from 1981 to 1998. In 1995, President Bill Clinton appointed her to the District of Columbia Financial Board, whose job was to balance the city's budget. She was a senior fellow at Brookings Institute until her retirement in 2003. A prolific scholar, Dr. Ladner has authored, co-authored, and edited 8 books, including Tomorrow's Tomorrow, The Black Woman, The Ties That Bind, Timeless Values from African American Families, and Mixed Families, Adopting Across Racial Boundaries. She has received numerous awards, including the Distinguished Alumni Award from Washington University and honorary doctorates from Howard University and Tougaloo College. Charles E. Cobb, Jr. was born in Washington, D.C. and attended Howard University. He was a Mississippi Field Secretary for SNCC from 1962 to 1967, working primarily in the Mississippi Delta. A founding member of the National Association of Black Journalists, Mr. Cobb was a foreign affairs reporter for the National Public Radio from 1985 to 1997, and a member of the editorial staff of the National Geographic magazine, the first black writer to become one of the magazine's staff writers. In 2008, Mr. Cobb was inducted into the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame. He is the author of On the Road to Freedom, a guided tour of the Civil Rights Trail. His forthcoming book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible, will be the topic of his presentation tomorrow at noon at the Whitall Pavilion in the library's Jefferson Building. He is currently a visiting professor of Africana Studies at Brown University, which is my alma mater. Finally, our moderator, Wesley Hogan. Wesley Hogan is director of the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University, where she earned her master's degree and PhD in U.S. history. She works on the history of youth social movements, African American history, women's history, and oral history. Her book on SNCC, Many Minds, One Heart, SNCC and the Dream for a New America, won the Lillian Smith Book Award, the Scott Bills Memorial Prize in Peace Studies, and the Library of Virginia Nonfiction Award. She was the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Race Relations from 2006 to 2009, whose mission is to bring together community organizers, researchers, and young leaders to promote healthy communities. Between 2004 and 2008, she worked with the Algebra Project, the Young People's Project, and the Petersburg City Public Schools, and coordinated an oral history project for the civil rights movement in Petersburg. She is currently working on 2 oral histories of youth in the 20th century freedom struggles.
Thank you.
And one brief editorial comment. The books are here, and they are right back over at that table, available for sale, purchase, and by cash, credit, or money order.
Is Charlie's new book out there too?
Charlie's new book will be out tomorrow, so you will have to come in order to pick one up. That's how we roll around here.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I want to first thank so much the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian. When I first began to interact with SNCC people, I was about 15 years ago, and Curtis Muhammad came right up to me and gave me a huge hug and said, "You're a child of the movement now." And I was befuddled. And then he took me through and began to talk with me. And what I was thinking about when I saw the streets of Greenwood just now, as well as the clips earlier, is that the videos that the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian have now made available to so many of us are going to allow many more people to be embraced and taught how to move by SNCC and other civil rights movement veterans. And so I'm very, very grateful for being able to spread the capacity, the experience of having SNCC people in our lives on a much more widely known basis. I'm going to try to set the stage and then turn the mics over to the illustrious people on the movement roundtable today. But I wanted to just note quickly that it seems to me like most freedom movements have 3 phases. You have a lot of people who can't figure out how to get from idea to action, right? A lot of people just sitting around the kitchen table, unable to figure out how to move. So the first phase is just trying to figure out a protest. So we see that sometimes. And then the second phase is trying to get from protest to power. So how do you get from the Mall on Washington into the Hall of Congress? And then once you're in Congress, the third phase, how do you govern as if you want to be the change that you want to see in the world? And it seems to me like most liberation movements historically only make it past that first juncture. They get to protest. But today I think these 4 people, I very much feel that I'm in the presence of 4 people who are central to moving the African American freedom struggle, and in fact the American freedom struggle, from protest to sitting at the power table in Mississippi, and giving us the opportunity as a country to open up that table and break apart a white supremacy that had been part of the country for 300 years. And we don't really know very much at all about how to build true grassroots democracy or quality education for all children as a central part of civic life. And so if I can, I'm going to quote from Vincent Harding and say that these individuals have led the way, freeing up what he called a vast new creative and democratic possibility for people, for us, drawing on the deepest wells of the larger freedom struggle. So with that, I want to ask them if they'll start maybe 5 or 7 minutes each, and maybe we can start with Dr. Ladner. And the question, no, it's all right. I want to try to set the stage a little bit and just ask if you might each talk about who you were before you encountered the movement and what directly brought you into the movement? And maybe I'll give a little bit of a nod just to make sure that we stay on time and give everybody a chance. But if you could talk a little bit about who you were before the movement came into your life and then how you got involved.
Well, the movement came into my life very, very early. And I would say it started officially in high school, I think it was 1958, 58 or 59, when my sister Dora and I, along with some other high school students, under the direction of Clyde Kennard and Vernon Damer, organized the Hattiesburg NAACP chapter. Who was I then? I think that this concept of freedom and wanting to, understanding that we were not equal by any means, really was in my family's DNA, because my parents, especially our mother and her siblings, always told us that no one, you're as good as anyone, and that when you look at white people, look them dead in the eye and don't blink, so that they will respect you. And somehow she figured out, she and her siblings and other black people we knew, figured out how to demand respect in an environment that was absolutely unilaterally opposed to respecting black people. We had very early influences. We were fortunate, and I always tell young people today when they ask about how can I find why aren't people being role models to us, and I said you have to seek out role models, because we were fortunate to have a gentleman, an herbalist, who was a cousin to our aunt, and we called him Dr. McLeod, and he subscribed rather to black publications, and he always brought them to us to read, and we had teachers, and so that's who I was. I mean, which was essentially a very sensitive young person who knew that when Emmett Till was murdered, that they had struck and killed someone my age at a time when I was trying to develop some sort of self-actualization as a preteen going to adolescence, and it made me feel more powerless than I could imagine. So I kept a scrapbook, clippings. Dora and I always got Hattiesburg Americans every day, and we cut the articles out, but everything was censored. Moving on, that's who I was when I came into the youth chapter, and then we went to college in fall of '60, got expelled for demonstration, and then went to Tougaloo, and that was heaven. That's when my life really began. By the way, my sister Dora received an honorary degree from Tougaloo College yesterday for her human rights work. It was just wonderful. And the citation was essentially the introduction that you just read about her lifelong activism.
That's wonderful. Do you want to talk about what drew you into your first movement activity when you first got to Jackson, or?
When we got to Jackson State, we knew Medgar Evers, and always went up to his office on Wednesday afternoon, which was the free period, and we slipped off. We weren't supposed to go there, but we did. We always signed out of the dorm. That was a prison like Parchment for the women students to go to shopping, and we ended up the street, always looking around to make sure no one saw us going into the Masonic building. He told us about a Tougaloo student sit-in that was coming up, and first I remember asking, can we be a member of it? Can we join it? First he said yes. Then he thought about it for a minute. He said, no, I don't think so, because I don't know what I would tell your mother if you got expelled, and you would be expelled at a state college like Jackson State. And Medgar had come on campus a few weeks or a few months earlier and brought me some money from my mother. God only knows how he was introduced to her in the supermarket, grocery store, I should say, in Hattiesburg. He came on campus and he said, I met your mother in Hattiesburg yesterday in the store, and she gave me this money to give to you. It was about $5 or so, $4 and something and change, as I recall. And I was like aghast. I said, thank you. We knew him. We called him Mr. Evers, and so. But he did tell us that day that what you can do is to organize a sympathy protest when the Tougaloo students are arrested. And we joined other students. We did, and we got expelled. Dora, I'm sure we can talk about that because I mean that was extraordinary because we were simply going to have a prayer protest. Sympathy protest in front of the library that night after the Tougaloo students were in jail that night. By the way, the Tougaloo students had sat in, that was the first sit-in in Mississippi, they sat in at the public library. The reasoning being that this is a public facility paid for with black people's tax dollars as well as whites, and they can't use that library. We couldn't use it, so they were arrested. And we were marching, we were standing in front of the library. In the middle of a prayer, Emmett Burns, one of our friends at the college, was in the middle of the prayer saying, "Oh God," something to the effect that, "watch over these students as they are in jail," and da-da-da-da. And we heard this loud voice, someone screaming, "Stop this, break it up, break it up. What in the world is going on?" And we looked around, and it was the college president. He had gone berserk. His name was Jacob Reddix. And he was just running through the crowd. And he came up to my roommate, Eunice and Margaret, and he grabbed Eunice's shoulder like this and pulled her forward and then knocked her on the ground. And
this is Jackson State.
Yes,
a black man.
Yes, a black man. Of course, there were all the presidents of the college. Yeah.
I've heard the story, but I never heard what actually happened.
That's what happened. And all of us immediately turned on him, like started screaming at him, "How dare you, you can't do this," and so on. And a few minutes later, the white police came on campus, and they broke up the demonstration. We went back into our dorms that night, and an hour or so later, Dean Gill came over and told Eunice that she was expelled. She had to be out of the dorm before daybreak. And Margaret and I were saying, and all the other girls who were piling in our room saying, "You didn't do anything wrong, you shouldn't have to go home." And we were very upset, but we were 17-year-old kids. And so she called her parents. They drove up from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, on the coast, probably a 5-hour drive at that time, 6 hours. They got there at 4 a.m., I remember that, when they came to the dorm. And they didn't want to take her home because they were angry that their daughter had been knocked down. The word was the president had slapped someone, but he actually knocked her down on the ground. He didn't slap her.
Wow.
And so her parents we had helped her pack very, very reluctantly. And they stayed around that morning to try to see the president, Reddix. He refused to see them, and they drove her home. At that night, some of the guys called over to the payphone in the dorm and said, we couldn't see each other, so we were organizing this over the phone. We're going to meet early. Everyone should wear black or white tomorrow. Should wear white, I think, or black.
Dr. Ladner, can I pause you for a second?
Feedback.
Okay, so we're going to try to keep the mics up here so they can record it. Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt the story, but I just wanted to make sure that we give everybody a little bit of time. But you did not disappoint, because I cannot imagine a more dramatic entry to the movement. And so Dr. Reddix is, maybe if we can get back to that story about how people responded in the question and answer. I want to know what happens. Charlie, do you want to talk a little bit about who you were before you came into the movement and then how you got involved?
Okay. Sort of like Joyce and Dory, I mean, a big part of my involvement has to do with the DNA in the family. Our family was active going way back. My grandmother here in Washington, D.C., worked with Mary Church Terrell. She was the publicist for the National Council of Colored Women's Clubs. And my other grandmother in Durham, North Carolina, you will appreciate this, Wesley, hated Duke University. She fought Duke University because she thought that Duke, rightly in my view, destroyed the black community. Duke, the old black Fayetteville, community, Haiti community. As far as she was concerned, Duke University was her enemy. And that's all part of it. My father studied under Howard Thurman and all of that, Malcolm X came in and out of my house because my father defended his right to sell Muhammad Speaks in front of black churches on Sundays as they let out. And I was too young to appreciate all of that until much later. I'm some kid, who's Malcolm X? Some grown-ups, they're talking stuff, And I grew up with stories of our family's enslavement. My Aunt Hattie, great Aunt Hattie, who lived to be over 100, was the family historian, and she felt that it was her duty to make sure we were aware of this. But again, they were stories from some farm in Mississippi. I didn't know anything. So all of that was a part of it. The big turning point, and even the Montgomery bus boycott, which excited my parents, didn't really trigger much with us. Emmett Till did. His murder. Now, we saw that in the Jet magazine, but as young guys, we really weren't looking at Jet magazine for the news. We were looking for the centerfold and the ladies in the bathing suits that Jet magazine always had in the centerfold, and we made our way to Emmett Till's murder via the lady in the centerfold in the bathing suit and the startling picture of Emmett Till's body bloated and beaten as it was pulled out of the river triggered conversation in us about essentially what kind of place was Mississippi. What kind of people are these? I mean, we knew about police brutality, and we even knew a little bit about segregation, because at least in those years, if you were young, your parents most often sent you to your grandparents or somebody in the South. In my case, to Durham, North Carolina, and where you learn the rules, a little bit of segregation, or learn the rules of behavior that were expected of black people in those days. This is the 1950s. Now, it was the sit-ins that really, for the first time, triggered a real interest in the movement. And what I saw was people my own age, and the sit-ins happened February 1, 1960. I was a 12th grader, but I was planning to go to school, college. And if you were black and going to college in 1961, the odds were overwhelming you'd be going to a historically black college or university. And if you were at a historically black college or university, you would probably be going to school in the South, then Wilberforce and Lincoln and Central notwithstanding. And if you were going to school in the South, you would be confronted with exactly what we were seeing on television and in the front photographs on the front page of the newspapers: segregation and students, people our own age, resisting it. So the question that was coming through, looking at the Nashville students, which reached us via television, and the Atlanta University students, which reached us via television, well, what are you going to do when you get there? And I'm going to tell you two stories and then turn it over to Dory about what are you going to do and what I think it means. Firstly, when I got to Howard University, there already was a student protest group in existence, NAG, the Nonviolent Action Group. And they were having sit-ins in Maryland and other places. Now, I'm a freshman. I was vaguely aware that there were sit-ins going on in Maryland. But actually, and this is the fall of 1961, I'm sitting on the campus reading the first issue of the Howard Hilltop, the student newspaper, edited by Michael Thelwell, who would become involved with SNCC. And the big story I remember in that paper was a story about the Howard University students who had gone on the Freedom Rides that summer. So I'm sitting under a tree reading that story just as somebody comes up to me and gives me a leaflet saying there'll be a bus leaving from campus to picket and sit in Maryland. So I decided I would get on that bus and see what that was about. And maybe this is some kind of early reporter's instinct, because I've been a reporter most of my working life. I gravitated to the group I heard talking that seemed to know the most about sit-ins, and sort of either ingratiated or embedded myself with that group. And what I didn't know, I was going there to just look and maybe picket. What I didn't know was that this group that I had attached myself to was planning to sit in and get arrested. So I'm talking to them and with them in Annapolis, Maryland. And I continue to talk and think we'll get the picket signs and we'll walk up and down in front of the store, but they go in the restaurant. Antoinette's Pizza Shop, which was frequented by the midshipmen at the Naval Academy. And they sit in, and then when the police are called, refuse to leave. And then they do something, even though I've been watching the sit-ins, I had never heard of. They went limp. So they had to be dragged out. And I picked up on what they were doing, so I grabbed myself to the biggest person in the group, and Cortland will remember her, Janet Rose Cortland. Yeah, I just grabbed a hold of Janet, and I said, well, if they're going to drag us out, they're going to have to work hard to drag us. And wound up in the Anne Arundel County Jail. So that was A. And I'll talk about the meaning of that in a minute. Because I had been involved now, and then I continued during the whole both semesters to involve myself in pickets and sit-ins, and because of that, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, invited me to a workshop for young people in Houston, Texas. And they gave me money for the bus ticket, because you didn't fly in those days. And I bought a bus ticket from D.C., Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and on into Houston, Texas. But I got off the bus in Jackson, Mississippi, because the students were sitting in. And you have to understand, our image of Mississippi, at least where I was, in D.C. and Springfield, Massachusetts, where I went to high school, was entirely shaped by Emmett Till's murder. So I felt sitting in Maryland and Virginia is one kind of thing. Sitting in Mississippi was an entirely different proposition. So I had no concept of what those students might have been like. I thought that maybe they had some kind of special gene that got them into act. Anyway, I wanted to meet them. And I made my way to their headquarters. That's where I met Dory and Collier Liddell and Jesse Harris. And I explained to them that I was going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights. And one of these students, who lived here for many years, Lawrence Giad, then just finishing up at Tougaloo and about to go up into the Delta where SNCC had begun a voter registration project, got up and leaned over me, and Giad's a big guy, and sort of half bullying and half with contempt sneered at me. And he said, and I remember the words exactly, he said, "You're going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights. What's the point of that when you're standing right here in Mississippi?" I had no intention of staying in Mississippi. I was passing through. And at that point, when Giat said that, another one of these students, Jesse Harris, stood up and looked at me and said, "Yeah, you're in the war zone here."
So you never made it to Houston?
I got the message. They were saying, basically, you know, yeah, you can go off and chatter about civil rights if you want to, but we're doing stuff here in Mississippi. And if you're serious about your commitment to civil rights, then you'll stay with us. And I did. I wound up, my attitude was basically, well, it's the summer. I don't have any school, so I can spend the summer with them. I didn't realize that once you started this, you couldn't just pick up and say, well, I got to go to school now, so goodbye, folks. You're kind of there until you really knew it was right to leave. So I stayed in Mississippi for 4 years, I guess, instead of getting back to school. Now, the lesson
Charlie,
in all
can
this...
I pause you for just a second because I want to give everybody time.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. I just want to say in one sentence what the lesson of this is that as much as the civil rights movement was defined by protest against white supremacy, the more important aspect to understand about the civil rights movement is that it was made by the challenges black people made to one another within the black community.
Thank you. Ms. Ladner, do you want to talk a little bit about how you came into the movement and who you were before you came in?
Well, I must say that I must have come in as an angry young lady early on. You said to hold it close to my mouth? Yes. I can remember growing up as a child, probably about 3 or 4 years old, with my mother challenging us to always look white people in the eyes. And she grew up in a small community, Wayne County, Mississippi, the Willard family, which was a blurred racial line family, I must say. And in that family, they interacted with whites and blacks, and it's a small community. And Mother said, there's nothing to be afraid of fighting white people. They're just like anybody else. And she challenged us as I kept growing up. My sister Joyce and I were probably 5 years old, 6 years old. And that was put into my brain, and it stayed there. I must say that, on the other hand, maybe I haven't said this before, but Mother had visitors from the other race, the white race, who called her cousin. And that's the duality of Mississippi for some reason I don't understand. Going on past that, I was always serious about my environment. I dreamed a lot. I didn't like where I lived. I didn't like Palmer's Crossing where I was growing up. It was a small community, the church and the school, and the schools were very poor. Our equipment was very bad. Our school books were always second or third hand. You could read the white kids' names in the back of our books. Then science lab was terrible. I remember the toilets in the bathroom running out, the sewer running out on the grass in the back of the school. Our community was very devoted to us. Our teachers would purchase books for us to help us. Miss Zola Jackson was our primary teacher, Miss Barnes, Miss Trevelyan. They would purchase books and help us to learn more because we didn't get extra income, well, they didn't get extra income to buy books to teach us, but we did know all about black people. We were taught at an early age, James Weldon Johnson and other people. And our community, for every aid that we got, Joyce and I would get, Miss May Mixon would give us a dime. She ran a little club on our street. And so we were happy to run and report to her that we'd gotten these aids. We would show our report card and we get an aids, which was an incentive for us to do better. That was the beauty of the community. We had a large extended family, the Willard family, my mother's family, and the people in the community were very supportive. We had one white store there, Mr. Hudson grocery store, and we walked everywhere we went. They had gravel streets, no street lights, and what I always felt terrible about was I didn't have books to read. I always wanted to read. And whenever I had the opportunity to get a book, I would devour it very quickly. I can remember sneaking bronze thrill books into the, these were taboo books, My True Story in my shirt, coat sleeve into the house past Mother, and going into my room and reading it, but the lights would go out and then I would be peeping around the corner with the corner light on at night trying to read these books. And that was the only reading material I was able to get beyond my class books. And as Joyce mentioned, Dr. McLeod, medicine man, NAACP membership salesman, would bring us the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. We'd read that. And Hudson's store had the Jet magazine, the Ebony magazine, and I'm not sure what else, but we didn't have money to purchase them, but we would stand there and look at them and read as much as we could. And that was the only resource material that we had. and going downtown, you're faced with segregation. The Woolworths was separate. You could buy candy, something from the counter, but you couldn't sit down. We most times didn't have money. Mother would send us downtown to pay bills on this segregated bus, and we had to sit in the back behind an imaginary line whether there were whites on the bus or not. And I remember the bus driver calling you the N-word. It was just mean. I think most of the white people who were the meanest drove the buses. I do believe that. I've had several encounters with that. But going downtown to pay bills, and I often say that going to Sears, Roebuck and Company at that time, it was the white ladies and the colored women's bathrooms. And I would stand and just stare at it. And there's the colored fountain and the white fountain. I couldn't understand. And I couldn't understand the difference between white ladies and colored women. And that I pondered over that for years, trying to understand it, and I still just didn't understand. These were things that were called to my attention by myself, because we didn't have any type of movement or anything going on that I knew of. I've later learned that there was a lot of activity going on in Hattiesburg, but we were young kids. The first introduction, I would say, came through our church. Mrs. Beard, the sister of Vernon Damer, played the piano in our church. And she would talk to Mother. She was a very good friend of Mother's. And Mother allowed us to go to Jackson, Mississippi with her in her car and Mr. Damer to NAACP state meetings. And that's where we...
How old were you when that happened?
I was probably about 13, 14 years old, and met Mr. Medgar Evers. And we were, we were small kids, and in the Southern tradition, you were taught to respect your elders, and you don't engage adults in in their talk. So you are more of an observer. I remember riding in the back of Mrs. Beard's car and driving the 90 miles north to Jackson without uttering a word, and driving back south 90 miles without uttering a word, because they had their own conversation. Maybe Joyce and I may have said a word, but we didn't talk to them. We were observers and we listened. And so those experiences, and in the environment of Palmer's Crossing in Hattiesburg, I noticed that there were two colleges. It was called Mississippi Southern at that time. You had William Carey College. They had absolutely nothing to do with the larger community. They employed some black people as cooks, maybe, and laborers. They built a special dorm for the students from Latin America. We learned, Joyce and I were downtown at times, and we saw these darker skinned people talking in a foreign tongue, and we tried to imitate them, but we didn't know what they were saying. And I was appalled that Southern would go so far as to use money to build a special dorm for these people and bring them on campus. They were as dark as we were, but they allowed them to come to campus. I didn't understand geography. I didn't understand anything about dynamics of the whole world. I didn't know what other countries meant. We weren't that proficient in geography. We knew the United States, but we didn't know foreign territory like Latin America and South. I do remember on Highway 49 seeing some darker skinned people on the back of a truck, and I later now know that they could have been Mexicans or others, laborers, but we had no outside intervention for the most part. We were encapsulated in our small community. And you get to our little community off Highway 49, going to New Orleans or to the coast. But the community was so supportive, so supportive. We had a lot of nightlife. We had a lot of church people. And you know how the eagle flies on Friday. Literally, it would fly on Friday. And they would go to play, which is true. The honky-tonks and people get ready and would juke all night and until Saturday, late Saturday. Reverend Timothy, and then on Sunday mornings they would get up very well dressed and go to church. And so I couldn't understand that. And the one thing that that really bothered me was that there were a group of ladies who were very close to us, geographic-wise, would oftentimes get up on Sundays and ask the church for forgiveness. And the deacons would pass the resolution very quickly and say they were forgiven, and amen was passed, and it was done. I didn't know what they were talking about. We didn't know. But and it was like every third Sunday, whenever they had this church, these women would get up and ask for forgiveness. So all of this was going on in our community. My parents didn't drink, but everybody on our street sold liquor, I must say, with the exception of maybe one or two other families. And the sheriff would come every Monday and collect the money, driving a black Packard on one eye, and he would drive up one side of the street with his hand out, and then he would turn around and then come up the other side of the street.
Okay, so I'm going to pause you because that's a beautiful image. And I'm going to ask us to actually come back to that when we talk about going into towns and the way SNCC moved in towns and how they worked with local people. But that image of the sheriff with his hand out in one eye is, I think I'm going to pause there. Wow. Bob, can you talk a little bit about who you were before the movement and what drew you in?
Hello. Testing. So I was born in Harlem Hospital in the middle of the Depression. And a few years after I was born, the Roosevelt administration and the people who ran the city decided to provide some housing for black people. So the first housing project was set up across the river from the Yankee Stadium, the Harlem River Houses, and my family moved in there when I was a couple years old. And shortly thereafter, the World's Fair came to New York City, and my father's older brother, Uncle Bill, was teaching at Hampton Institute, and he had decided that he would compete for the design for Virginia's pavilion, and he disguised his address and so forth, and sent in his application, and actually won it. And then they announced his name. First time a black person's name had been put in the newspaper and used Mr., and they found out that he was black, and they rescinded his award. And so one of my early memories is Uncle Bill coming up in the kitchen there with my father, and they drank liquor and cooked food for 3 days, and just talked and talked and talked about that and what it meant. So I'm about 5 years old around that time, and being introduced to something's really wrong here, folks, and something that penetrates down into what the immediate father, uncle, that really has a deep grip on them, but they can talk about it and laugh about it and cry about it, but really can't do much about it, right? So we had Herb Plummer. Mr. Plummer was a southpaw in the Negro Leagues baseball, and he was living in the projects, and as I hit middle school, 6th, 7th grade, he started up a baseball team. So a couple years before Jackie Robinson got into the major leagues, we were fielding a fully uniformed baseball team, the only black team in the city, called the Harlem River Athletics. We were 30 strong. We would go on the buses down get playing fields to practice in Central Park, take the trains around the city, and play in the White Leagues. So that was a really liberating experience for us, going around and actually playing ball all over the city. When I was in the 6th grade, if you're thinking about how the country was moving during those times, you know, Conant, president of Harvard, had set up ETS after World War II, and the country went on a talent search. And so in New York, they started something called Rapid Advance, so you do junior high school in 2.5 years instead of 3. I was a January baby, and you actually went to school in January in those days. You could start school in January. So they scooped up 2 or 3 black kids from every elementary school. I went to PS 90 in Harlem between 148th and 147th and 7th and 8th Avenue. And 2 or 3 of us from every elementary school in Harlem and the South Bronx, and put us all together at STIT, PS 164 on Edgecombe Avenue. So in those days, New York had 3 teams, and we lived, the Harlem River houses were situated between the New York Yankees across the river and the New York Giants, which were in the Polo Grounds, right below Coogan's Bluff there on Edgecombe Avenue. And so I went to Stitt Junior High School and had a good education there. Had a German math teacher. We learned algebra. My brother had taken the test for Stuyvesant. He went to Douglas, PS 139 in Harlem. And he was in Stuyvesant, so I was going to go to Stuyvesant. So I took the test and got into Stuyvesant. That would have been about 1949. My brother made friends with Al Poussaint, Dr. Poussaint. Al's father was a printer, and the only people that would give him work were the communists. So Al ended up going to the Red Diaper Baby summer camps, Campo Chica, right? And he and my brother liked that and became junior counselors and then counselors. I went once. I didn't like it. They walked around and sang "I Found a Peanut," and that song goes on and on and on, right? And of course they liked it because there were a lot of young ladies there, right? But I used to hang out with them in the winter because they would go to camp reunions and they would go to hootenannies. And actually, Pete Seeger, we saw him down in Greenwood in 1963. So I first heard Pete Seeger at the hootenannies in the village. And he had a big impact on me because he was always talking about the lynchings that were going on in Florida. And so we saw that other movie or the other documentation about the veteran in the Korean War and his problems. And Herb Robinson, we called him Blue, who was the shortstop on our team, didn't come back from the Korean War. When I turned 18, I was in the middle of my freshman year at Hamilton College, and we had the draft then. And so I had been thinking, because of the activities that I've been in and Pete Seeger, and thinking about, what was my place in the country, sort of. And so I wrote my draft board and said, I don't think I want to fight in the up-and-coming wars, right? And so the draft board gave me my student deferment. I carried that through college and then graduate school. And then, remember, in '57, Sputnik happened. The Russians sent that monkey up into space, and they extended eligibility for the draft, avoidance of the draft, to teachers of math. My mother passed, she was really young, in 1958. My father had a breakdown, he was hospitalized. I left and came back to New York and got a job teaching at Horace Mann School. Actually, what happened before I got that job was I had gotten a fellowship, the John Hay Whitney Fellowship, and I went to the person who was running that fellowship, and when I came back to New York looking for a job, and he said, well, Frankie Lyman needs a tutor. Frankie Lyman was, at that point, under 16, and his manager wanted him, they wanted him to go on the Alan Freed Big Beat tour, right? Chuck Berry and a lot of other people. And he needed a tutor because the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children wouldn't let him go unless he had a tutor. And so I said, okay, let me look at this. So I went and talked to his manager. His manager, or his owner really, was head of Roulette Records then, right? And he was opening up the Knights of the Round Table on the East Side in Harlem. And I went into this nightclub. They were still fixing it up. And I told him, I'll take this job. They're paying a lot of money, $125 a week. Frankie was making $4,000 a week on this tour, right? I said, I'm interested in the job and I'll take it, but if Frankie won't study for me, I'm not going to just take his money. I'm not going to just stay, right, and just, be there so he can go on this tour, right? So anyway, we hit the road, and it opened my eyes because I understood for the first time that Harlem was an appendage of New York City. And I understood that because we went into all these little towns, and in every little town there was this little black enclave, right? And so it dawned on me, I couldn't understand it living in New York, that Harlem was just an appendage of downtown New York City, right? Anyway, Frankie wouldn't study. And I left, right? And of course they had to yank him off, right? So they were furious, right? Because he was losing all this money, right? Frankie was living right around the corner from Stitt, where I went to junior high school, PS 164, with his grandmother. They said that they were saving all his money until after he became 25. So he hadn't, and he was still living in this one-room flat with his grandmother, right? But they took him off the tour, and they were furious at me. They were trying every which way to see how they could get me. But then the tour hit Boston, and there was a riot. And so then, all of a sudden, they called me.
What year was this?
This is 1958, okay. Right? And there was a riot in Boston, and they were so happy that Frankie wasn't on that tour, right? That they called me back up and said, would you tutor him again, right? So I said, okay, we'll try. And we did a couple of spins around Central Park with the horse and buggy, and then I told him, no, Frankie still won't study, right? So that was so then the thing what actually woke me up was the sit-ins. When I was at Horace Mann, and when the sit-ins broke out, I understood that this was something that I had to really take a look at. So I called Uncle Bill and went down to Hampton, and the students at Hampton were sitting in at Newport News, and I walked with them over to Newport News and walked the picket line while they sat in. And Wyatt T. Walker came down from Petersburg to give the mass meeting, and he announced that SCLC was going to set up an office in Harlem to raise money for King. And so I got the information from him and actually made the organizing meeting. Bayard Rustin ran the organizing meeting for that office. And then every afternoon I would go down after school. I was at Horace Mann and volunteer. They were doing the fundraiser at the 369th Armory where my father worked. He had worked there during the Depression and was still working there as a janitor. And Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier were the headliners for this event. And then after it was over, and actually Jack Odell was the other person I remember that was in that office there. So after it was over, I went up to Bayard and asked him if I could go down and work with King in Montgomery. I thought he was still working in Alabama. And Bayard sent me to Ella Baker, and so, as they say, then that was it.
Wow. So we're going to do a little bit of looking at Freedom Summer or the Summer Project, and I wonder if we couldn't talk a little bit first about maybe both why the Summer Project was necessary and what kind of organizing methods you found to be effective. I mean, I think the Streets of Greenwood set it up pretty well in terms of showing the kinds of white terrorism that were prevailing in the state at the time. So if maybe we could just have you guys talk a little bit about what were the reasons behind the Summer Project, what made it necessary, and what organizing methods were most effective operating in those conditions.
I'd like to jump in before they get at it. It was really Medgar's assassination. So the Streets of Greenwood that we're looking at is happening in the late winter, early spring of 1963, right? And SNCC field secretaries get arrested, and we end up in federal district court. So the SNCC field secretaries, at that time, we had a meeting in Greenwood, and you know, and I mentioned in the film there about Jimmy Travis getting shot. So when Jimmy was shot, all of the SNCC field secretaries came and converged on Greenwood. And Joyce was mentioning when we were sitting watching it that there weren't that many of us. I mean, probably throughout that period there were about 30 young people from the ages of 17 into their early 20s that were the backbone. All of them from Mississippi except Charlie and myself. I mean, if you want to know their names, we should maybe have a listing of their names at some point. But so when when we were in jail, Medgar was coming up to Greenwood, and you saw, I don't know if you noticed, but Dick Gregory was one of the people that they were hustling into one of the cars. And Gregory flew down a plane load of food. The guy, the Mississippian there, was talking about how they take care of the colored people, but that year they actually cut off the federal commodities. And so that was an opening for us. We raised the food and then told people, well, look, the reason you don't have food is because of the politics. So to get the food, you need to agree to go down to register to vote. So we had hundreds of people going down to register to vote. And after we were put in jail, Medgar was coming up and helping and holding the mass meetings with the other SNCC people. And then, remember, Medgar was right after Greenwood, Birmingham happened, and then after Birmingham, Medgar started in Jackson, and then he was gunned down June 11th, 1963. So when Mega was gunned down, three different things, I think, converged. One, Allard Lowenstein, who was kind of political operative on the Hubert Humphrey wing of the Democratic Party, came down and decided he had to come and take a look at what was going on. The other person was Robert Spike, who was the executive director of the outreach for the National Council of Churches. He came up to me in August at the March on Washington and said because of Mega's assassination, he had decided that the National Council of Churches had to get involved in the civil rights movement. And he had decided, furthermore, that they should focus on Mississippi. It was the only place that they could say they were working with all four civil rights organizations, because we had that COFO operation there. So Lowenstein makes a move, Robert Spike makes a move, the SNCC field secretaries make a move. They decide that they are not going to now just focus on voter registration, and there's another story behind that. But so there's the rekindling of the idea of parallel politics, a freedom vote, people running for office, right? And all of that happens then in the fall of 1963, right? And the start of the idea of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So if you're thinking about how Freedom Summer actually came about, as opposed to the question why it was necessary, but how it actually came about, I think leading into Greenwood and then coming out of it and Mega's assassination really crystallizes the forces that made it actually a possible thought, right?
You're going to have to bring the mic up so they can keep you on the record.
Sorry, apologize. I was thinking about, I took your questions that you sent us this morning and just jotted down some things. And one was, I think, the increasing isolation of the movement. Isolation in the sense that the white guys had begun to win against us. They were arresting everybody. I remember being in Greenwood when Bob got arrested. Got there, I guess, first we went over to Greenville where Charlie was. Then the next day we drove to Greenwood, which is not far away. And I immediately, set about using my skills, which was to type, office work. And we had a lot of people coming through the office that weekend. But I remember going home that night to stay with whichever family I was living with. And realizing the next morning I get back to the office had been bombed. So what we did was, I remember going through the file, trying to retrieve all the files to get the names of the people. We kept cards on people who were attempting to register to vote a lot, sometimes I should say, and trying to get those records so that they wouldn't fall into the hands of white people who would then have proof, as to who was involved. And we moved the office over to Reverend, the Methodist minister, Donald, his church. And one incident that I recall often was that we were marching down to the courthouse, and I heard this voice hollering. Then, there are always the FBI standing on the sideline, as we said, taking notes, talking to the sheriff and constables and so on. They were all one group for us, because they never, ever intervened to do anything except to beat us. FBI wouldn't beat you, but the local cops would, and FBI stood there alongside them. And hearing this voice saying, I need a payphone, I need a payphone. Does anybody know where a payphone is? And I turned around and I saw this girl coming up, and she said, I need a payphone. Do you know where one is? I got to call the Justice Department. And I just stood there for a second looking at her. Who in the world is this black woman who knows someone in the Justice Department to call? It was Marion Wright, later Edelman. And she'd come down to Greenville from Yale. That she was in law school for spring break, and she I said, you know someone in the Justice Department? She said, yeah, where's the payphone? I led her to the payphone. I mean, that was an example of how isolated we were. John Doerr was different. John Doerr, head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, did a lot, as much as he possibly could. And I think Marion had spent a summer interning or something at the Justice Department. But it was the danger was increasing rapidly, exponentially. When Jimmy Travis, our classmate at Tougaloo College, was shot that night in the neck. He and Bob and Randy Blackwell, driving along, and here comes some good old boys who were solid citizens and shoots, aiming for Bob and shot Jimmy. I think also the expanded scope of our work, of the movement locally, it expanded. Movement was going into other towns, but far too few people, too few organizers. There was, in effect, increased expectations. More black people were getting involved, but it's not a matter of how do you manage them. People manage themselves, but can you send workers to these different places where they're asking for workers to come? For the workers to come. The other that I learned a lot more about recently was the expanded reach of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. And I say recently, over the past 20 years, 15 years or so. I've gone through the records extensively and learned of the role that the Sovereignty Commission played with the president of Brown University in getting Dr. Adam Beidel fired from Tougaloo College. That happened in '63 after I spent my junior year of college, and he was fired. We didn't know exactly what was going on, but it was the State Sovereignty Commission that had led the fight also to revoke the charter of the college.
Because he was supportive of the movement.
Because he was supportive of the movement, and not only supportive, but very proactive. He always told us that you can go and demonstrate and go to jail all you want to, so long as you don't lose sight of your main reason you're in college, and that was do our studies. So we took our books to jail with us, or had someone bring them to us. But he was a pivotal person. He went on local television to defend the right to vote. Tougaloo College, I mentioned this because it played such a critical role as we always called it the oasis. It was the only place where integrated groups really could safely gather. And we had professors, Ed King, whom I saw 2 days ago, and my mentor, Ernst Berinsky, and many others who were there for us. Our faculty and staff went to jail with us, and was the place that welcomed Freedom Riders. The first day Dory and I rode onto campus after we were kicked out of Jackson State. So we saw all these people sitting around on the ground, and they were an integrated group, and learned they were Freedom Riders who had come back for a trial date.
So it sounds like Tougaloo was a really important piece of how do you operate in this kind of terroristic environment, right? Tougaloo was an incubator.
It was critical. It was critical. Yeah. Guillotte went there. A lot of us, who came into SNCC were Tougaloo students. Most of us were, in fact.
I think in talking about the summer project, it's important because it will illustrate a real difference between the organizer and the community leader. It's important to note that the summer project was intensely debated by the organizing staff of SNCC, and some, myself being one of them, were opposed to the summer project. That's a complicated story, but nonetheless, in this debate, we had reasons, the organizers' reasons really, about the risk to pretty fragile grassroots we've been trying to develop when you brought upwards of 1,000 people into the state from college campuses, and the issue of whether or not they overwhelmed the local organizations you were trying to build, particularly because there's a racial element in this, although I think the opposition and debate over the summer project has been wrongly cast as a racial debate. It's more debate about outsiders in large numbers coming to the state. What it illustrates, though, is the difference, because organizers, Dory was very much for the summer project. Hollis Watkins was opposed to the summer project. So was Charles McLaurin. These are the organizers. But every single person in the communities where we worked were for the summer project. Every single person, without exception. Because from their experience, people coming from the outside was a good thing. It gave them bigger exposure. They felt, less alone. Mrs. Hamer backed me into a corner and said, "Charlie, I'm glad you came down here. What's your problem with having other people come down here?" Now, what am I going to tell Mrs. Hamer? I can tell you nothing. Because the contradictions in power. You can't say on the one hand that people should make the decisions affecting their lives, at least the important decisions affecting their lives, take control over their own lives, and then turn around and say, "Well, I don't like your decision, so I'm not going to work with you anymore." You can't do that. You have to adopt the organizer's response has to be, I'll respond to what the community feels it needs as best you can as an organizer, which is how all of us who were opposed to the summer project said, well, if they're going to come, then we'll make the best of it. And those are the real roots of the Freedom Schools. and that's what we did. But it's a more elaborate discussion than we have time for.
But that's really helpful to hear. That's really helpful background. Did you want to?
What was the question? I was out.
Well, so I wanted to, because you were out, I wanted to bring up something that you mentioned to me a few weeks ago. You mentioned that it would be important to talk about Guyot and Mrs. Hamer and why, when they went through what they went through at Winona, they were able to stay and fight. And I think that speaks to the issue of isolation, as well as to what Charlie was just talking about in terms of trying to find some way for people to stay together and work in this very unbelievable environment. So would you mind just responding to that a little bit about why you thought people were able to stay and do the work despite torture and constant violence and threat of violence? It's a really important piece.
Of course. I was in Chicago when Jimmy Travis was killed, shot. He's deceased now, excuse me. Yes. I was up there raising food and clothing for Mississippi. But I came back to Jackson probably around March. And the demonstrations and boycott were in progress at that time in Jackson. And that's one scene. But going over all the other scenes in my head that I felt the reason for the summer project, I'm looking at Bob now, and I can remember hearing Mr. Lewis Allen talk to you in the COFO office on Lynch Street about why he was going to leave Liberty. I overheard the conversation. And he said he had to get out of there because he really felt that something was going to happen to him. And I was listening and in sorrow, and I felt helpless because the situation, we were all at risk, and there was nothing we could really do about it. So he left that night. It was at night, and he went back to Liberty. That was one situation. When Medgar was killed, we had eaten dinner with him at the Elks Lounge that night, the night of the 11th of June, 1963. Dave Dennis, Matt, and I, after the demonstration, the boycott was on in Jackson, and we got up from our tables, and I got in the car with Maddie and Dave, and Mr. Evers got in his car. He said, "See you in the morning. See you in the morning." And he was killed that night. That was another situation. But aside from a cumulative effect of all the things that had gone on, that had happened, I had been arrested December 1962 for attempting to integrate Woolworths, and Joan Mulholland and others had been brutally beaten at Woolworths in '63, the spring of '63. And many atrocities had happened. I'd spoken with the Freedom Riders, Diane Nash and James Bevel, and Paul Brooks and Catherine, when they stayed over in Mississippi, and I enrolled in Tougaloo College, I was able to engage them in conversation about strategy and nonviolence. I met Bob Moses and many others, Chuck McDougall, John Lewis, and others who had stayed over and were talking about what I had been thinking about all my life, but hadn't been able to link it to anybody. But these were people I could link to and continue the work that I had envisioned in my head. So, and going up in the Delta and encountering the sundown laws when COFO was organized in August of 1962, we went up there. I did not know that they had sundown laws, meaning that blacks had to be off the streets at 12 midnight. And we, when we first got into the building to found COFO, the firemen came into the building. You remember the firemen came in and said there was a fire in the building. We said, no, there's no fire. And when the meeting was let out, it was past midnight. So we got into cars and we're going back to Jackson. And Dave Dennis was driving the car that I was in along with Maddie and Collier. And stopped, and Lester McKinnon stopped the car on the side of the road and told Dave to get out and get into the car with the police officer. And he kept him back there about 45 minutes. And to make a long story short, he arrested Dave, took Dave back to Clarksdale, and Dave said, follow the car. We followed the car, and policemen came out and told us to get the F out of Clarksdale. And so we were wandering around all night long trying to find Mr. Adams and Moore's house. But the other thing we heard was that Milam, who had killed Emmett Till, was the night watchman in Ruleville, and that was a 10 o'clock curfew for blacks. I did not know that all this existed. Living down south in Hattiesburg, I did not know that. I do know that they had plantations and so forth, but I did not know that blacks could not be on the streets in certain places in the Delta and other places. I didn't know. I wasn't familiar with that. So to make a long story short, so when the vote came up for Freedom Summer, I said, I'm all for it. I want everybody in the world to know. I want to pull back the curtain and let them look down on Mississippi and to see what is going on down here, to see what has happened to us. Bob had attempted to make a citizen's arrest in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and was arrested for that. So I thought it was a novel idea. I was watching it, but so many things had happened, so many things. But the point is that we wanted outside intervention. We needed outside intervention. We were there by ourselves. And we were not going anywhere because I'm from Mississippi. And I wanted to change Mississippi. You heard me talking earlier about growing up without the essential tools of learning and so forth, and wanted to make change. So I wasn't going to leave. I wanted to make change. It's like the hyena drawing a line in the sand, literally. And I said, I'm going to step across this line. I don't give a damn what anybody says. I'm stepping across the line. And I stepped across the line. And I meant to step and stay on the other side. So that was my position. And Charlie understood all of us because we were all very fiery, right? Yeah.
Well, I think Bob might want to say something too about that, and then maybe, do we have enough time to then open it up to the, okay.
So, hello, testing. So the question about the necessity of Freedom Summer, I can answer that from the personal point of view, although I think the better question is, well, how did the movement there in Mississippi come to the point such that something like Freedom Summer was actually possible and doable, right? But the necessity for me personally involved two other assassinations. We talked about Medgar's assassination. The first assassination that I was part of the theater in which it took place was in southwest Mississippi in Amite County when Herbert Lee was murdered by Eugene Hurst, who was the representative from that area to the Mississippi legislature. Dr. Anderson came and got me in Macomb and said that there was a body that had been lying at the cotton gin all afternoon, and they had brought it into Macomb to a funeral home in Macomb, and then called him and asked him to come look at the body. And because it was Liberty and of our activity out there, Doc came and got me, and we went down together to look at it, and it was Herbert Lee. Herbert Lee was part of the NAACP network in Amite County, and he had a pickup truck, and so we were living at Steptoes, who was the head of the NAACP, but it was in Herbert Lee's pickup truck, Steptoe, myself, and Herbert Lee would move around. Amite was really rural, so there was no walking any place. So when Herbert Lee was murdered, he had left, there were his wife and 7 children, Prince and 7 children. I think the oldest was getting ready to do high school. There was really, the only thing we could do was kind of commit ourselves, and ourselves then was really this is in September 25th, 1961, just a handful of us really in southwest Mississippi and another handful in Jackson. Amzie Moore came down after Lee was murdered, and we spent a week just going out in the roads trying to find witnesses. Amzie knew enough and was rooted enough so he could knock on doors at midnight and wake people up, and they would talk to him. We found one person, Lewis Allen, and that's what Dory was talking about. She's talking about in '63 when Lewis Allen is coming up to her and actually talking about his problems and his life being threatened. I mentioned before that Robert Spike and the National Council of Churches had gotten involved, and Guha was heading up the Hattiesburg Project, and he and Robert Spike and the National Council of Churches decided they would have a Freedom Day. This is, I think, in December of 1963 or January 20th, okay, of 1963. The reason for Hattiesburg is part of another dimension of this, which is the Justice Department and the suits that they were bringing. So an unprecedented court case had happened in Hattiesburg. A 3-judge panel from the 5th Circuit actually came to Hattiesburg and sat in Hattiesburg in judgment on Theron Lynn. The registrar in Hattiesburg. And so Spike was a kind of politician of the church, right? And so you remember in August, the March on Washington, Kennedy's still president. He announces they're going to have a civil rights bill, right? And so Spike brought in over 50 ministers from the Midwest. They participated, Doris talking about that citizen's arrest. So we had our first integrated picket line at the Hattiesburg courthouse. And the Spike's idea was to bring the ministers in. They went back to their congregations, and then the National Council of Churches organized busloads to go to Washington to lobby for the Civil Rights Bill. So all of that is happening in this theater. That fall, we had our freedom vote, and we had the students come in from Stanford and Yale, and so that actually opened up the question of bringing in the country to look at this. And so we're having the argument at, I think it's Mrs. Wood's house there in
And at St. John's Methodist Church.
about whether we should have the freedom, the summer project, and we get a call that Lewis Allen has been murdered, right? And so I leave and go over to Amite County. So the necessity then for me was that when Herbert Lee was murdered, we could commit ourselves, but not much else. But now when Lewis Allen was murdered, and they had harassed him since September of 1961, broke his jaw, arrested him, ruined his logging business, and then finally murdered him at the cattle break in front of his house. So we were able to call on the country then to come and take a look at itself. We needed to do that.
And I should say, in terms of the dynamic of the staff, up until that point, it seemed to many of us, probably all of us, Bob had really let the debate play out, and the staff had not taken a forceful position about the summer project. It seemed to us, and I remember talking to Curtis Hayes about this, that Lewis Allen's murder was a tipping point. And Bob's pressure on the staff to go with the summer project becomes greater. And for a number of us, then our attitude was really personal. If it's this important to Bob, and he probably won't like this characterization, if it's this important to Bob, then we'll go with the summer project. You know, that's independent of all the other, you know, Lewis Allen's murder, Herbert Lee's murder, Medgar's murder, and a bunch of other less prominent murders and acts of violence. I think people today don't have a real sense of how violent that state was, how murderous that state was. And one of the problems I acknowledged, despite whatever misgivings I might have had about the Freedom Summer, was the country just was not paying any attention to it. Nobody cared about what was unfolding in Mississippi.
But one of the most important things I think that this panel offers the country is the chance to look both from a political point of view and from an education point of view at who counts. And I think that the Lewis Allen story is really important for that reason, right? That is a major driver of the Summer Project, and then the Summer Project makes visible to the country what is happening.
Yeah, Lewis Allen and Clyde Kennard and Medgar, Herbert Lee, all of them.
There were too many people murdered. I've never broken down before over these things. And at age 70, I finally allowed myself to feel the pain. Clyde Kennard was the young man from Hattiesburg, been a paratrooper in the Korean War, used the GI Bill to go to the University of Chicago. His father died, and he moved back home to Hattiesburg to Kelly's Settlement, the neighborhood Mr. Vernon Damer, and Mrs. Beard, my mother's best friend, our mother's best friend, lived in. And he went back to run the family farm. All he ever wanted to do was to finish his education. So he applied 3 different times to Mississippi Southern College, now the infamous University of Southern Mississippi.
each time he was turned down, but he was the most first humanist I ever met, first intellectual I ever met. Went to his home once after he got out of Parchment prison, and his had bookshelves from ceiling to the floor in his house. He was such a humanist that he believed that even the white people would understand reason. So one time he had a meeting with the president of Mississippi Southern, John McCain. John McCain and a subsequent or recent president of Mississippi Southern, Aubrey Lucas, who was registrar of the college at the time, conspired with the State Sovereignty Commission and the governor to have illegal liquor put in the trunk of his car. Another time they had him, arrested him for receiving stolen property. He bought chicken feed from a co-op, and they said that he received that the chicken feed he got was discounted, was stolen. He was sent to jail in Hattiesburg. I remember walking down the street, Main Street, and then walking around Pine Street, where the jail was, and just thinking that here he was up there. I was in high school, and this happened. Had no idea as to how to navigate to go up to the jail to try to see him or whatever. They sent him off to Parchment for 6 years, hard labor. He got sick in Parchment. He was teaching reading, literacy. He was writing letters for the prisoners. And he was working 6 days a week in the cotton field, chopping cotton, picking cotton, and so on. He got sick. Eventually, at an advanced stage, they took him to the University of Mississippi Medical Center Hospital. Clyde was diagnosed with colon cancer, terminal colon cancer. The doctors urged that he be released from prison. They didn't. I remember Larry Steele, the Jet reporter who spent a lot of time in Mississippi. Thank God for Larry, he's dead now. One day I was talking to him on campus. We were telling him about the story of Clyde Kennard. And we had started a petition campaign to try to get him released. Larry put it in Jet magazine. Dick Gregory got involved, and Medgar had been involved, but Medgar would go up to see him every week in prison. Finally, it was brought to Ross Barnett's attention as governor. He did not want this man to die in state custody, so he released him. I went home. I was in my junior or senior year of college, and I went home to see him, and it was just before he went to Chicago, where his sister lived, went to Billings Hospital, the University of Chicago. Dory went up to see him. She could tell her own story about she and Curtis having gone to visit him. But that was my first, he died in July 11th, I believe, 4th or 11th. Anyway, he died that year. Then he was one of our first two mentors. The next one was Vernon Damer. I was in graduate school in January 1966. 6 o'clock in the morning, my mother was on the phone. The phone rings early, and I get up, and mother said, "Joyce, what are you doing?" I said, "I just woke up. You woke me up." She said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes, Mother, what's wrong?" "I just want to make sure you're all right before I tell you the bad news. Mr. Damer was killed last night." This was when the Ku Klux Klan firebombed his home. He got his family out, went back in his house and got his gun and started shooting at them, as Mr. Damer would do. That's who he was. And he looked whiter than the Klan, as did his sister. And he got sustained third-degree burns, and he died later that morning. That was when my faith in all that we had been fighting for evaporated. I always had delayed reactions to things. I believed in nonviolence long before everybody else said they no longer believed in it. But when those two men who had taken the interest in us as 12, 13-year-old children were killed, I mean, I changed.
So I really appreciate the sharing of the context of the summer project with the audience, because these stories are incredibly hard to hear. But I think if it's all right, I'm going to quote Charlie to himself before we turn it back to the audience for some question and answer. And one of the things that these stories lay out are the incredible bravery and steadfastness of the SNCC people and the local people in breaking open the Democratic Party at both the state and then the federal level, so that by 1968 you have these new rules in place. And Charlie has written eloquently that those new 1968 rules, you can trace a direct path from them all the way through the election in 2008 of Barack Obama. And so I think that that's a really important, can I quote you on that? Okay. So I want to thank and honor the stories that you all shared today and helping us understand the context under which the summer project took place. But I'd like to keep that framework in mind about the way that this particular set of incidents broke open a possibility for democratic practice that the country had never before seen. I'm going to see if there are people in the audience who'd like to ask questions. We have about 10 minutes, and then we're going to move right into Bob's talk. So I don't know if we have a circulating mic. Yeah, we do.
Good evening. My name is Wesley Alfred. Very honored to be in the presence. I'm a professor at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia. And this is very gut-wrenching. I have a project in my class that they read Anne Moody's autobiography, Coming of Age in Mississippi. And I know that she mentions at the end of her story that she became disillusioned as well. And I just wanted Ms. Ladner to, if she has the energy, Dr. Ladner, to extend how what you felt. I know that I've tried to get in contact with Anne Moody for some time. I know she's faded from public eye. And I know some of the story. I don't know if the Ladners remember Arthur Strickland from Hattiesburg. He just passed. He was one of my mentors at the University of Missouri. So, if you could elaborate on some of that. Well, in the context of what Anne Moody felt when she became disillusioned by all of the violence and, you know.
Yeah, okay, well, Anne's story, we were in college with Anne. I'm sorry, we were in college with Anne, and Dory and I were, and she worked mostly in Canton with the CORE project. And I can't speak to her story. She left in '64, I believe. Was it '64 around Dory? Yeah, she left in '64, and she wasn't active after that. Violence was every place.
was just omnipresent. But we didn't think about the violence while we were going through it, because you get paralyzed with fear if you allowed it to overcome you, the fear to overcome you. You just kept going anyway. And so everybody who was effective had some healthy respect for violence, and he tried not to court it, for sure. But I can only speak about my own disillusionment at that time as being related to the deaths of these two men, of course, of Medgar's earlier, yes, absolutely. And those three men were my mentors, and they were all struck down with the same thing. I didn't allow myself to remain disillusioned by any means. It was a temporary thing, just as I was disillusioned with at the end of Atlantic City when we left with nothing. That was a great letdown for all of us. But you know, to wallow in one's misery, in one's anger, in one's disillusionment, is not productive. And I always try to remain, even to this day, a very productive person. So it was a phase, but it was one that nevertheless had a strong impact on me, and I dare say all my fellow SNCC workers.
I want to speak to Ann Moody. I think you may have seen my name in her book, and you're asking my sister, but it was me, so I'll answer. I last saw her in New York in 1966, and at that time she was transcribing the book that you mentioned. And I would say that having known her at Tougaloo, she was engaged with CORE and was not in the thick of things as we were. And when she left Jackson to go on a speaking tour, she never came back. And in New York, I stayed in her apartment briefly, but the title of her book was supposed to be The Girl Who Can't Go Home. And I couldn't understand at that time what it was all about. But I haven't seen her since that time. The other issue is the disillusionment. There were so many things that I've narrated, even from the Emmett Till death on Mac Charles Parker. I heard of Willie McGee before then. I was a small child. Mac Charles Parker, who was thrown in the Pearl River, Emmett Till, and Reverend Lee up in Belzoni, Mississippi. I read about it in Jet magazine. Thank God for these black news organs that we could sort of peep at. But those things only made me want to try and do something about it. You heard me say the line was drawn in the sand. Of course, death is found. Death, when Mr. Evans was killed, I was devastated. He was the first person I had known who was murdered, and someone that I was very close to. When Mr. It pained me, it still pains me. I went to Arlington Cemetery about 3 weeks ago with a TV crew, and I was like lifeless standing there with all kind of thoughts flashing through my head and coming back and forth. But I felt good about it as well as sad. Progress had been made. He was dead, but Mr. Evans, I'm here, and I'm still trying to carry work forward. When Mr. Damon was killed, I was in Natchez, Mississippi, working against the Ku Klux Klan in Natchez, southwest Mississippi, in January. And Mr. George Metcalf's leg had been blown off at Armstrong Tire Rubber Plant Company there in Natchez. That was the first place we had stayed at when we went into Adams County, Mississippi. He was president of local NAACP. And you had Mr. Wallace Jackson, who was killed at Armstrong Tire Rubber Plant Company by the same people. But these situations were going on, and we had to keep moving. We couldn't stop. Although there was something going on, the small things happened, but then it got bigger and bigger, so you had to mobilize and strategize and to figure out how you were going to survive. I never sat in the front of a car because I couldn't drive. I always sat in the back seat, and I always felt that the drivers, Stokely and Ivanhoe and whoever else could drive, would take over the wheels. And I never went to sleep in a car after we all ran off the Nashville Straits with Charlie in the car going to Nashville, Tennessee. Landon McNeil was driving the car, and we ended up in a field going to Nashville, Tennessee in December of 1962 with Miss Hamer in the car. But these are types of things happen, but it didn't stop us, okay? So we just kept pushing. And I thank God for that song, Keep On Pushing.
I think I just want to, in direct response to your question or your point, there's some words from Dave Dennis that he spoke during the service for James Chaney, one of the 3 Corps workers who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, that seem relevant, and because I think they reflect what a lot of us felt. If I can just read them. He says, "I don't grieve for James Chaney. He lived a fuller life than most of us. He's got his freedom, and we're still fighting for ours. I'm sick and tired of going to the funerals of black men who have been murdered by white men. I've got vengeance in my heart tonight, and I ask you to feel angry with me." It's Dave Dennis at the August Memorial Service for, I should add to that, the Dave went on, he didn't abandon struggle. He became Corps' regional Southern director that same year.
Need a question in the back?
Yes, Aize Sabater. I'm a local educator and social entrepreneur, and I want to thank God for the sacrifice and just tremendous gift that you have given the continuum of history for African peoples in the diaspora, so thank you. And so two quick points. One is, as a local educator, my question is maybe to even the organizers, what could be done to have, what could be done to have more teachers, local professors, in the midst of this? I mean, the history is so thick, you could cut it with a knife right now. You could palpably feel the power here, and more children. You know, I worked with an organization where we bring the stories of luminaries like you to life, and we've worked with 10,000 children in the area, and they would love to be able to engage in this. And so it's a shame that there are really no children here. All these seats should be filled so that this story can be passed on. So my question on that is, what could be done so that more teachers and educators, I'm seeing Dr. Carr here, who's a professor at Howard, and other professors here, I'm sure they would love to have their students here engaged in this type of dialogue. So that's one. And then the second one, on the birthday of El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm X, what was the, how did you all wrestle with his position as it relates to Freedom Summer? Because I'm sure he was right there in the room that you all had to wrestle with those positions. Thank you.
Well, I'll answer the first one. Just invite us to speak and, you know, to the kids. And I think that more organizations like Teaching for Change should use video, you know, feeds so that you don't burn those of us senior citizens out, you know.
We might want to do a little explication of that, because you guys have done some really interesting work with Teaching for Change. Do you want to, Deborah, do you want to speak briefly about
Yeah, let Deborah speak.
Say real quickly, and then we can share a link. Maybe you could share a link with the people who are here, but the SNCC Legacy Project has just launched a collaboration with the Zen Education Project so that veterans can do virtual visits to classrooms, and so we can go to collaborate with you on that. And Dory Ladner did the first one with students in Birmingham, Alabama, and the students tweeted their questions ahead of time and then tweeted throughout their conversation with her. And there was another one today with Judy Richardson and students in Indiana, and one coming up, I think, with Stuyvesant next week. So, but can that be shared with the participants here?
the link for Teaching for Change?
And how to find out more about it, right?
Thanks. Guha, is this being videotaped today?
Yes, it is. And it will be ultimately, after it's closed captioned, it will be up on the website and will stay up.
can we order copies? Is it going to be available beyond the website, I think is the question.
No. It's they're taped for the website, and then they're up in perpetuity.
Sorry, yes, the Malcolm X birthday is
I would
today.
like
Yep.
to speak to Malcolm's view. I think it was evolving. I mean, I think certainly in the beginning, meaning Montgomery bus boycott and the sit-in movement and the freedom rides and Martin Luther King, through certainly the early part of the 60s, my view, Malcolm didn't understand the dynamic of the Southern freedom movement. He was really harsh on Reverend King, accusing him of being an Uncle Tom, teaching the Negroes, to quote him, to be defenseless. I think this was clearly changing, at least at 2 points. One, when the group from Mississippi came to New York and met with him, Mrs. Hamer was in that group. And then when Malcolm came to Tuskegee and Selma in 1965, by now he had left the Nation of Islam. He had formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity and is really grappling with what the Southern movement meant. It's very important to understand Malcolm as a Northern man. He himself says in his autobiography, I know nothing of the South. And we don't know how he would have evolved, because after he was killed literally weeks after he left Selma. So we don't know how he processed that Southern experience and where it might have led organizationally in terms of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which he formed after his break with the Nation of Islam.
Thank you for your question. So it is my great honor, and I have to say, when Guha told me that, can you come do this, I was scared, and I'm not scared because they're scary. It's scary to be in the room with them because they are such a force of powerful inspiration for me as a teacher and as somebody who really deeply cares about the civic life of the country. So it's been such an honor, and I apologize to all four of you for cutting you off at various points to try to get to the next person. Yes, but it is really such an honor to be with you all today, and I want to thank you so much for sharing this set of stories with us. Yes?
Yeah, I want Tim Jenkins to stand. Timothy was in the Greenwood film
Video.
that you just saw. Turn around. And also Cortland Cox, other SNCC people, Cortland Cox and Dion Diamond are here. Where's Dion? Dion was here. Yeah, Dion went to jail about a dozen times at least.
Yeah, and so I want to thank you all so much for being here with us today. And I'm going to ask us to celebrate them for a minute, and then we're going to directly turn to Bob Moses and his keynote this afternoon, the title of which is We the People, Constitutional People and Personal Responsibility for the Message of the Preamble. So I'm going to ask us to celebrate the panel and welcome Dr. Moses.
open it up and see if we can have a conversation about the issue of who the constitutional people are in the country and what is their job, right? What is the work that they have to do, right? I think of the Freedom Riders, the sharecroppers, the Fannie Lou Hamer crowd. They were all acting as constitutional people, right? The Freedom Rider is not looking to the state of Alabama as they are moving across the state. They're looking to the federal government and to the idea in the Constitution that citizenship means something, right? And the same goes for the sharecropper going down to register, and for the members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party going to the Atlantic City Convention, right? They're looking, they're going there thinking that they are citizens of the country. The party is a national institution. It means something. They're not looking to the state of Mississippi to legitimatize their efforts, right? So we got Jim Crow, or slavery by another name, out of those three distinct areas of American life, the public accommodations, and then the access to the vote, and then the national party structure of the Democratic Party. We did not get it out of education, right? And so in some sense, the big unfinished business that we were involved in that times, and which is the huge issue for the 21st century, is the issue of whether the country, whether we will gather ourselves together in the country and decide that all the children in the country are also our own, and whether we will figure out that we actually need to lift the issue of public school education to the level of the Constitution, that there should be a constitutional mandate for educating all of the children in the country. So there are other issues. There's the vote. We need an affirmative right to vote, as opposed to what we have now, which is the 15th Amendment and a negative right to vote, that people shouldn't interfere, and if they do, there are consequences. I mean, we will be fighting brush fires around the right to vote forever unless we get an affirmative right to vote. Whatever, right now the issue is, well, all these communities, they need to organize themselves and overturn whatever the states do and go to court and have grassroots movements all over. But we will be doing that forever unless we get an affirmative right to vote. But I would like to focus more on the issue of lifting education to the level of the Constitution, as opposed to, for us, the issue of the vote, right? Just because can't talk, we don't have time enough to talk, I think, about both. So if it's okay, I'd like to zero in there. William Alexander Percy, who was a plantation owner in Greenville, Mississippi, and who's was the father of three Percys, Leroy Percy, and then also Walker Percy. Now, some of you may know Walker Percy, the novelist. Well, Walker Percy, who was the son of William Alexander Percy, was Walker Percy's, the novelist's, grandfather, right? And William Alexander Percy was the respectable face of white terror in 1875 when the White Leagues took over the electoral process in Mississippi around the election of the Mississippi State Legislature, and the Democrats took over the state in 1875. And to look it up, you need to read the Boutwell report. Senator Boutwell from Massachusetts led the Senate investigation of what happened in Mississippi during that time. So there's a 2,000-page report about terror and violence and the overthrow of legitimate government that had been elected by the black vote. Because remember, in 1870, when the 15th Amendment was passed, Mississippi had a majority of black eligible voters, and when Grant assigned Albert Ames to be the person who oversaw that territory, because Mississippi, remember, did not ratify the 14th Amendment, and so was not eligible to come back as a member of the Union. And Grant assigned Albert Ames, who was one of his generals from Maine, to oversee that territory, which included some parts of Louisiana, I think. But in 1875, and Albert Ames had been elected governor in 1873 with the black vote. But in 1875, when they overthrew that government, William Alexander Percy went into the state legislature for just one term. He was concerned about the articles of impeachment for Albert Ames. And so he was a lawyer. He was a Princeton graduate. He had gotten to Mississippi in 1841 from an area of Alabama, the Huntsville area of Alabama. His father loaded close to 90 slaves and the whole plantation on a boat on the Tennessee River, and took the Tennessee up to Paducah, Kentucky, where it meets the Ohio. And then they floated the Ohio to Mississippi, and then came down the Mississippi and landed in near what is now Greenville. And the slaves cut their way through. I mean, Mississippi was a wilderness, right? You had panthers as big as young calves, right? And bears and everything. And they cut their way through the cane brakes to a place called Deer Creek, which is the place, the creek that goes through the city of Leland, Mississippi, right? And they set up the Percy plantation. Well, William Alexander Percy was just 7 years old and made that trip, right? He was educated on the plantation and then sent to Princeton, graduated from Princeton, I think, in 1857, then spent a couple of years at the law school in Virginia and was a lawyer. And so he went in 1875. He fought in the Confederate Army, was nicknamed the Gray Eagle. He went in to oversee the articles of impeachment and apparently was concerned about one particular issue, which was that the money that had been set aside for the education of the freed slaves should be used to build the railroad infrastructure for the Delta to set up the plantation sharecropper system. And there's a book out, I think it's Christopher Spen. He's at the University of Illinois. He just, a book not too long put out about the education of freed Negroes in Mississippi. And he really, in that book, is documenting how black people in Mississippi really established for the first time the public school education in the state during the Reconstruction period following the end of the Civil War. Although, from one point of view, the Civil War didn't end until 1875 and Mississippi won. So I was on the witness stand in the spring of 1963, after the streets of Greenwood. You know, Kennedy is still president. Bobby Kennedy's the Attorney General. Burke Marshall is Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. John Doe is the chief litigator. And we had been arrested in Greenwood, and our cases had been removed to the federal district court. And John was the lawyer. We had bussed over sharecroppers from Greenwood, so the courtroom was packed with sharecroppers. They were sitting on the benches, standing on the walls. John was standing in front of me. Judge Clayton was the federal district judge. He leans over. He just says one question. He says, why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote? So sharecropper illiteracy, which was established after 1890, right after 1875, during the period after Reconstruction right down to the Civil Rights Movement, is the subtext of the right to vote. And so basically our answer is, well, the country can't have its cake and eat it too. It can't have denied a whole people access to literacy through its politics and then turn around and say, well, you can't do politics because you're illiterate, right? So the other part of the civil rights movement that is not so foregrounded is the way in which the Justice Department and the SNCC work paralleled each other. And as it began, you know, our work began down in the southwest corner of Mississippi. And John Hardy was the SNCC person who came in and went to Walthall County in Tylertown. And when he took Ruby McGee, who had been a student at Jackson State, down to registrar, I think the registrar's name was Wood, and he was so upset, he reached in and got a pistol and whipped John Hardy with his pistol. And John staggered out into the street looking for the sheriff. The sheriff was looking for him, and John went to complain to the sheriff, and the sheriff arrested him for disturbing the peace. So that that put the Justice Department in a difficult constitutional place. What Burke Marshall did was unprecedented on the one hand. He filed a suit enjoining the state of Mississippi from prosecuting John Hardy before the trial. So for the federal government to enter into a state criminal prosecution and enjoin it before it even got started was extraordinary. John Hardy, myself, and his lawyer were in the chambers of Judge Cox in Jackson when John Doe was arguing that case. And when he finished arguing, he came over to us and said that he was going to go to Judge Reeves in Alabama from the Fifth Circuit Court to get an injunction, because, of course, Judge Cox, who was a Kennedy appointee, had denied his petition. Hardy was due to appear in court the next morning at 9 o'clock. We were in Jackson. He had to appear in Tylertown the next morning, and John Doe said, well, I'm going to fly over. And so he did. He had, talking to John Lady, he said that he called Judge Reeves. Judge Reeves asked him if he would bring the Attorney General from Mississippi with him. They chartered a plane, flew over, woke up Judge Reeves at midnight. He heard their case and issued an injunction. In the meantime, I turned to John Hardy's lawyer and said, we got to go down. John has to be in court tomorrow. And he said, no way you're going to get me going down to Tylertown in the morning. So John and I took off. We spent the night at C.C. Bryant's in Macomb and got up early the next morning, right, to get to court before anybody else. And you climbed up into, they had a little shelf in the back of the court, a buzzard's roost, no chairs on it, just a shelf. And you went up there, and we sat and watched the courtroom filled up with these white men. And then finally, the county attorney came in and announced that the case had been enjoined, that it was postponed. So John and I hit it down the stairs, and they came after us like bees, right, coming out of the courtroom. And we had, you had the clutch, right? Didn't have automatic stuff, but we didn't stall, and we got on out of there. So, but the point is that the Justice Department now had a problem in Southwest Mississippi, which was if they filed suit against the authorities in that area, they were raising the question of federal protection against violence. And so they never did. The Justice Department never did file suit in those counties, Amite, Walthall, where violence was always the issue, and the issue of providing protection for voter registration workers or applicants was an issue. But they did change their strategy, and I think the SNCC work pushed the Justice Department so that they did change their strategy. And they shifted from going after individual registrars to filing suits against the state of Mississippi and the state of Louisiana. So if you read U.S. v. Mississippi and U.S. v. Louisiana, in the U.S. v. Mississippi, there's an interrogatory that thick, right, where the Justice Department goes back and looks at all of the education expenses for black children and white children after Reconstruction right down to the 1960s, and makes the argument that Mississippi cannot hold blacks responsible for literacy tests because they haven't educated them, right? So education, my point is sharecropper education, the education that says you get educated to the work that has been assigned to you, right? Sharecropper education was the subtext of the right to vote and the Mississippi theater of the civil rights movement, right? So if we think, how do we think about the preamble to the Constitution, the idea that there are constitutional people, and the idea that in 1787, when the Constitution is written, there are also written into it the concept of constitutional property, right? So there's the preamble, which says that there are, and think about the preamble, not so much what it says, but what it does, right? So the preamble creates a class of people, the constitutional people, right? But also in Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution, another class of constitutional people are created, the class of constitutional property, right? And in that article, it delineates something that's really peculiar, right? Which is that the most important thing is property. Now, there's a lot of talk about states' rights and so forth, but that article says that property rights trump states' rights, right? It says that anyone who owns some constitutional property, right, can look to the federal government to go receive that constitutional property if it decides to own itself, right, and run away and go someplace else, right? And it can do that across state lines and go down into a state, fetch that piece of property, and take it back across state lines back to its owner, right? So here is a country that has these two really conflicting ideas, two deeply conflicting constitutional ideas. One, the idea of constitutional people, the people who ordain and establish the Constitution itself, and then the idea of constitutional property, that constitutional people can own this constitutional property and that the federal government should protect the right of property ownership, not states' rights, right, but the right of individuals to own property, right, across state jurisdictions. So, you know, it was Thomas Jefferson in a letter around 1823 or so who said, we have the wolf by the ear, but we can neither hold on to it nor let it go, right? And he's talking about this constitutional property, right, idea, right? And the constitutional people who have this constitutional property, and they can't hold onto it, and neither can they let it go, right? They're in this horrible dilemma, right? And so, you know, the country, it's a piece of constitutional property that runs away by the name of Dred Scott, right, that sends the country into this dilemma that comes to a head, right, and boils over into the war of constitutional people. So we have our war of constitutional people about their constitutional property, right? And we come out of that war with an agreement on the 13th Amendment. I mean, even Mississippi, I think in the 1990s, finally agreed that the 13th Amendment was a part of the Constitution, right? So we agree on the 13th Amendment, but we really don't agree on the 14th and 15th Amendment to this day, right? So we agree that we are not going to be a nation that any longer has a constitutional concept of constitutional property. but we can't quite agree about who the citizens are. Who are the constitutional people, and what does it mean, right? So when I think about the country and its trajectory around the preamble, I think about it in units of 3/4 of a century units of time. So from 1787 down to the war of the constitutional people, roughly 3/4 of a century. And then roughly 3/4 of a century from the time when Alexander Percy goes into the Mississippi legislature and they impeach Adelbert Ames down to the civil rights movement, roughly 3/4 of a century. And in that first 3/4 of a century, we have this really high wire tightrope act of walking with these two contradictory constitutional principles, constitutional people and constitutional property. And then we get rid of constitutional property and we're into our second unit of time, our second 3/4 of a unit of time. Douglas Blackman is born in 1964 in Leland, right there near Deer Creek, where Alexander Percy and the Percys had their plantation. So he hits the first grade in 1970. And 1970 is the year that Mississippi is forced to integrate. So his parents are white working class, but they are also people who believe that the law has been said and they don't have a lot of money. And so he should go to school, public school, and he ends up going to school with the black kids. He hits the 7th grade, and for some reason, he's not sure, because I asked him, he decides that he wants to enter a contest to write an essay, and he's going to write about Strike City. So Strike City happened in 1965. Plantation workers at a plantation near Leland walk off and establish their own little place. They call it Strike City. And they're striking for higher wages and everything else. And some SNCC workers, blanking on Frank Smith actually joins them, right? So Doug Blackman writes this essay, and he wins a prize. There's a white school and a black school. They give a prize to each school. They think they're giving the prize to a black student at the black school, but it turns out it's him, Doug. So his mother and the teacher encourage him to give the talk to the Rotary Club the next year. When he does that, there's a guy in the Rotary Club who was one of the night riders that was shooting into Strike City, and he is furious with this young kid and goes after him. So Blackman all of a sudden discovers he's not writing about ancient history, right? So this leaves a big impression on him. He goes on to school. He becomes a journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He goes to Europe, covers the Iron Curtain, so forth, and then comes back and is working in the Atlanta office and raises a really deep question. He asks, what would we find out if we asked about American corporations the same question that we put to German corporations vis-a-vis the Holocaust. If we asked about American corporations vis-a-vis the whole issue of what happened to black people after slavery and the industrialization of America. And it writes an article that appears on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, and his whole life has changed because he's deluged with letters from all across the country of people whose relatives have been part of the whole scene where young black men are rounded up for vagrancy and put into indentured servitude, right? So Francis Biddle is the U.S. Attorney General. In 1941, when Roosevelt is president, and on December 12th, 1941, he issues Circular 3951. He sends it to every state attorney general, and says to them that henceforth the FBI is not to prosecute vagrancy as peonage, but as indentured servitude and slavery. And so Blackman wrote his book, Slavery by Another Name, right, and documented tens and tens of thousands of cases all across the Deep South of the way in which young black men were conscripted for vagrancy and sent into the mines as indentured servants and slaves, really. Slavery by another name, tens and tens of thousands. The practice comes to an end with World War II because President Roosevelt, 5 days after Pearl Harbor, right, understands that the country now needs young black men to fight, and the Japanese are going to propagandize them and ask them, why would you fight us when you are slaves in your own country? And Amzie Moore used to tell me how he was riding the Burma Road and listening to Tokyo Rose, who was telling black soldiers, why are you over here fighting us? So that period, the second unit of time, from the end of Reconstruction down into the Civil Rights period, is marked by the extension of slavery into the industrialization of the country. Now, William Alexander's son, Walker Percy, was the lawyer for Tennessee Coal and Iron and oversaw the acquisition of Tennessee Coal and Iron by U.S. Steel, right? It isn't clear why he did it. I mean, his family says it was melancholy. But in 1916, or 1917, actually, a year after his grandson Walker Percy was born, he went up and took a gun and shot himself in the chest. Right? So here we are. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. So 50 is still 2/3 of 75. We are 2/3 of our way into our third 3/4 of a century unit of time. And we're a country that lurches. We lurch forward and backward, forward and backward. And so we're lurching right now. We're lurching backwards. And the question is whether we will gather strength to lurch forward as we approach our third 3/4 of a century. And I think of the young people who are between the ages of 10 and 40, who 30 years from now will be between 40 and 70 and running the country, whether they will figure out a way to lurch our country forward. And so one of the big issues, I think, that they will have to figure out is whether they will help the country expand the reach of the preamble. So if you think about what we have done, in spite of ourselves and in spite of the lurching, we have managed to expand the reach of the class of we the people. So we began with white male property owners who were the class of we the people in 1787. And then across the last couple of centuries, we've managed to keep expanding the reach of that class. We have not extended it to young people. So young people are not constitutional people in our country. They have no constitutional rights. And in particular, they have no constitutional rights to their education, right? And that's the latest on that really was the San Antonio versus Rodriguez case. Part of the movement, 1968, 400 Mexican-American students march out of school in San Antonio, demanding better teachers, better school facilities. Their mothers take it to the court system. It ends up in the Supreme Court in 1971 or 73. Justice Powell gives a decision. He says, well, you can't bring this issue to us, to the federal courts. You can't look to the federal courts for relief on your equity issue because there is no substantive federal right to an education. And so the legal profession then, went state by state. There are 45 cases in 45 states. And let me just end it with a look at New York State Campaign for Fiscal Equity. They got a decision from Judge DeGrasse, and he said the state should give more money to the city. Pataki was governor. He appealed it. And a 4-judge appeals court said no. And they said the reason why is that the state of New York requires us to educate our students to do 2 things, serve on juries and vote. And an 8th grade education is enough to do that. New York City is already offering the equivalent of an 8th grade education. They don't need more money. But one of the judges harked back to sharecropper education. He said, look, there are a lot of low-paying jobs. Who's going to do those jobs? What kind of education do they need? They don't really need more than 8th grade education. So sharecropper education, the concept of it, is with us to this day. Southern Educational Foundation, this is the last thing I'm going to say. They gave a report. 1970 was the year Douglas Blackman went to school with black kids in Leland, Mississippi. They looked at the top quartile of the economic distribution of the country versus the bottom quartile for 40 years, from 1970 to 2010. and asked the question, among other questions, what percent got BAs? Not what percent went to college, what percent got their BAs. So in 1970, 40% of the top quartile of the economic distribution got a BA. In 2010, 40 years later, 80%. It had doubled. In 1970, for the bottom quartile of the economic distribution, 7% got BAs. In 2010, 9%. It didn't budge. So Piketty, in his book on capital and the whole issue of inequality, he identifies the diffusion of knowledge as the principal instrument by which we might be able to, over time, at least make the inequality less, right? So for the 21st century, education is really is critical. And I think I'll stop. I could say some more about that and why it is, but let's stop. I said enough. Thank you.
We want to wrap this up, and we know that it's been a long day for all of us, and especially the panelists. But if Bob's willing to...
Yeah, I'm willing, if anyone has questions or wants to talk about these issues.
Any more questions, is that possible?
Or has a strategy.
Yes. Solutions are also, proposed solutions are also welcome. You might just have to speak up a little loud because I believe we are almost about to put away the microphones, but perhaps not. And yeah, here we go. Questions, please. Anybody? Yes, right down here. Patricia? Sorry. I just want to make sure we get you on the record. That's why we're asking you to use the microphone. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And, you know, I think when I think of our history, and I like the way you laid out those three-quarter centuries, but I come back to Brown. We just commemorated the 60th anniversary, and there's a lot of silence around it. And I think about generations, I mean, with you all up here today, and I think about Charles Houston, and I think about the lawyers who were always connected to the people, you know, building from the base. And I think about, you know, how young people and their parents were willing to go into court under these really dangerous situations. And I guess I'd like to see to what extent that history might have some lessons. I'll just say one brief thing. A student of mine just finished a dissertation at the University of South Carolina about what happened in South Carolina when they finally, by 71, are able to desegregate the schools and what these students face. And she follows black protest, high school students in 5 communities protesting the way it's done, the inequity of it, the tracking, the discipline. And they get some reaction. They have a state discipline law to regulate expulsions and that. So she shows the movement, but then she shows the power of the state and the communities to really just divert that. But I think the student activism sort of in tandem with these legal openings that are created, do you see that playing in a bit, or any lessons from that about how we organize today around that wonderful issue of constitutional people and citizenship? Because I think the struggle around education has been central to civil rights struggles.
Well, personally, I think we have to, the issue is the we the people force in the country. So, you know, there's the federal forces and the states, but absent a we the people force, these big issues are not going to shift, right? So I personally think we need a movement for a constitutional amendment around quality public school education. One issue is, are we mature enough as a country to even talk about something like that? So we haven't been able to have a conversation about that. So how, I mean, you know, I've been doing the Algebra Project now for 3 decades. I think of that, the reason why we can, it's an opening is because of the shift from industrial to information age technology. So the 20th century, it was post office arithmetic, which was, you know, the standard for literacy. And then reading and writing were what was needed to access the industrial economies, right? So information age economy brings quantitative literacy and algebra on the playing field. So there's a quantitative literacy as well as reading and writing literacies. And that has opened up a domain so that you can organize around this math literacy, right? In the same way as we organized around the right to vote, right? So for a while, there's this opening. It will close as soon as the transition period that we're in now from the industrial to information age closes. We don't really know how long that transition period, but once it closes, we will be locked into the status. We will be the serfs, just as the sharecroppers were the serfs of the industrial age, right? We are growing serfs in our cities. So the Algebra Project, in its small way, is I think of its work as working the demand side of the issue, right? So in Mississippi, the Mississippi theater worked the demand side. How do you get the sharecroppers to demand their right to vote? So how do you get young people and their parents to demand their education? But what's required is what are the other forces that need to help create a space so that actual demand can actually take place and grow. Right now, the educational public schooling that we have are repressive of demand of any kind. So how to push that, how to get the young people to agree that this is their job, their work. So that goes back to the first issue, which is what is the work of constitutional people, right? How does it get done? We're a young country, so it isn't too fanciful to think that as a young country we can learn how to do this work. We can actually decide that it's part of what we need to learn how to do, right? We don't know how to do it, right? Yes. So I've been participating with Peggy Cooper Davis at NYU Law School the last 2 semesters. We do this course. It's just a little seminar. 3 of us do it. Addison Francois, who's at Howard Law School, and Peggy Cooper Davis at NYU, and I joined them. So we've been looking at the Supreme Court cases and the evolution of the idea of constitutional personhood from Dred Scott right down to the Roberts Court, right? as just part of the work of excavating. And so one issue is, can we get a way of thinking and talking about this so that you could actually reach through to a wide population about the issue of constitutional people, the evolution of constitutional people in the country. We are a constitutional country. We are not going to be anything if we don't figure out how we become constitutional people in this constitutional country. I mean, if we decide that we are just going to be the couch potatoes of the constitutional country, then we're going to be in bad shape.
Thank you, Brother Moses, as always. Last time I saw you came to just outside Philadelphia, there was some young people in Philadelphia Freedom Schools, program that has lost its funding, but those young people continue, which really brings me to the question and conversation. The way I understand what Thomas Piketty is talking about in capital, it's going to involve at some point some type of redistribution of economic resources. I mean, he's not proposing a socialist model, but something, some wealth has to be distributed. And in the San Antonio case, as I understand it, when it was returned to the state, I mean, one thing Supreme Court says in that line is that ultimately, whether it be Texas or California, in most cases, you can't call on people to support education with their economic resources if they don't have them. So if there's an inequality, given the fact that much of public education is tied to property taxes, things like that, if they don't have the money, then of course they don't have an equal kind of resource. That having been said, I'm thinking about something that Ralph Bunche said, the generation before your generation took the reins and continued. The Negro is a special award of the Supreme Court, the federal concept, as you said, from Dred Scott coming forward, becomes very important. Constitutional people, constitutional property, two distinct categories, but perhaps they converge or meet around the concept of a property interest in citizenship. I'm thinking about some of the Supreme Court, particularly after Plessy, when I'm trying to remember the precise language of Plessy, but the gist of it is Negroes don't have and cannot expect to be treated as white people. In that case, a white man, maybe even gender. But in other words, you may be a citizen, but you don't have the right to expect to be treated like this class of citizen. That having been said, we've been talking about this federal constitutional amendment for a very long time, and continue to talk about that. How might you imagine this type of movement, particularly given your experience, the experience of the warriors in this room and beyond, at a local level? I'm going to bring it back to Mississippi, particularly back to Jackson, particularly back in the last 2 years, the Chocolate of the Moonbow, the People's Forum, this kind of thing, the Jackson Rising Conference that just took place early this month, and the idea of cooperative economics, things that people in Mississippi don't need to be taught about, but perhaps need to think differently about in terms of, A, posing solutions that can lead to a wealth transfer. Can we fund the schools differently through a different concept? And B, perhaps shift in anticipation of this transition you're talking about. Because I think this net neutrality conversation is exactly what you're saying. They're beginning now to shift to create ways to deny access in the information age. Shift the expectation from the federal level to the type of triggering events locally that force the federal government to respond, the way you all did in Mississippi. How might a kind of locally centered movement lead toward this, while we maintain the federal conversation, but ultimately kind of shift that burden to the local place and let people empower themselves and begin to think about that?
So there is an effort in Mississippi to have a ballot initiative, right? They want to collect 200,000 signatures by October. So they're going to try to use the Freedom Summer celebration to jumpstart this ballot initiative. And it's initiative geared to the issue of funding education. And I don't know if anyone here has the actual language of the ballot initiative. But anyway, so that's one thing. There's a question of, well, let me put it this way. Mississippi has taken pride in leading the nation, right? So it led the nation back in 1875. It led the nation again in 1890 around the issue of actually enacting laws preventing black people from voting. It responded to Brown with the Citizens Council and, led the whole South in that. With the Freedom Rides, Mississippi said, you can come in, but you're not getting out. The buck stops here. Fannie Lou Hamer, to my mind, as a product of Mississippi, helped lead the nation otherwise, right? And I don't know whether out of what's happening in Mississippi, the black people in Mississippi will figure out how they can help the nation move in a different direction. So it's an interesting issue. How do we get local initiatives that can help put pressure on the federal government? I think we need a national tax for education. The states don't have any money. The cities don't have any money. And the Roberts Court, in terms of the healthcare decision, opened it up. I mean, it said Congress has the right to tax, right? And so I think the country eventually is going to need a tax so that, and you need to read the works of Goodwin Liu. He's on the Supreme Court in California. He's written several articles in Yale Law School Journal, NYU Law School Journal, and Iowa Law School Journal. So basically arguing on the one hand that there is already a constitutional mandate for education embodied in the discussions leading to the 14th Amendment and not the equal protection idea, but the idea of substantive citizenship. What does it mean? What are the privileges of citizenship? And his other argument is that the greatest discrepancies in education are not within states, but between states. So we are not going to get a national solution to this problem state by state.
We have time for one final question. Here we go. Oh, two final questions. Okay. We'll split the time.
I wonder if you could tie this back into the commemoration of Freedom Summer. You started out by saying the two big issues you might want to talk about were voting and education. Seems like those are the exact issues you were dealing with during Freedom Summer, the Freedom School, and the Freedom Vote. So I wonder if there's just a way you could tie your thoughts back. What were the accomplishments of particularly the Freedom Schools, and then maybe how that influenced your thinking about these issues?
So the way I would try to tie it back in is that for the commemoration of Freedom Summer, we are actually trying to, there are 4 buckets that they are talking about. One is voting, education, healthcare, and work, right? Those 4 different issues. But so what we are trying to do, and there's some people here who can help us better, is not just focus on what happened then, but how what happened then So we're hoping that we'll come out of Freedom Summer. The mic is off, is that it? It's still on? We're hoping that we'll come out of Freedom Summer with some next steps, however tentative.
But maybe in your hands in a not secret way. You talked about the local action, and it strikes me that much of the dialogue about public education, in my mind, has been drowned out by the endless discussions about public education policy, issues like charter schools, and I hear very little that seems to talk about the education of children. And I think of something like the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. When I was in New York, when they first won, that's the part I remember. I don't remember the other side. But perhaps a way to link is do you think the elevation of this issue, I mean, and the timing of it with the commemoration of Freedom Summer might cut through some of that rhetoric and that positioning and that people take as they get into corners, looking for Superman, fighting Superman, not believing and all that other stuff that seems to be drowning out the public conversation about education.
Right. So, what can actually make a shift in the conversation? I'm wondering whether that data that the bottom quartile hasn't budged for 40 years, right? Whether that data could help make a shift, right? So we've been through all these reforms and all this talk, right? And it includes all the administrations, including Obama's administration, and there's been no movement at all, right? And in the light of now the conversation about the enormous inequality that has opened up, right, and Piketty's shifting the conversation now to shifting that from a conversation about income to a conversation about wealth, right? That's an important shift. So that shift, right, has an analog in education. And I think that data piece, right, that the wealth in this country has increased, doubled their percent from 40 to 80%, and the rest, the bottom quartile, is not in the picture at all, right? So that's a different conversation than talking about, you know, charter schools or everything else. And so, but who are the people to lead that conversation? Where are the voices, right? And part of the problem is that anyone who can afford to make sure that their children don't get trapped in this public school education, in the bottom. So you don't have, and this is from Obama on down, right? So you don't have voices of people whose children are there in the situation, right? But how to do that? I mean, and the Algebra Project is trying to have some conversations about that, but we don't have a voice in the public domain, right?
The first and last word should be Bob Moses's, but I'm going to have to break protocol and say thank you all very much for coming, but especially Bob Moses. And also equally and especially Dory Laudner, Joyce Laudner, and Charlie Cobb, other folks who are here. civil rights activists, the veterans. Thank you all very much for coming. And I put in a shameless plug for Charlie Cobb's book talk tomorrow at 12 over in the Woodall Pavilion in the Jefferson Building, 12 to 1:30. He'll be joined by moderator Rex Ellis from the Museum of African American History and Culture. Promises to be fascinating, and I'll promise for Charlie that he'll be happy to sign at least any books sold over the number of 10, if I'm not mistaken. Right, Charlie? Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.